Bullets whizzed past as Marines charged through the dense, misty jungles of Guadalcanal, dodging artillery fire and leaping over fallen trees, every step a battle for survival. U.S. Marines and Japanese soldiers clashed in relentless, brutal combat, fighting not just for territory, but for survival itself. Explosions ripped through the canopy, gunfire echoed through the undergrowth, and the island became a crucible of courage, strategy, and unyielding determination. Tonight, you will experience the entire story of the Battle of Guadalcanal. Every landing, every counterattack, soldier by soldier. Before we dive in, comment below where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I want to see how far across the globe this story reaches. In the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean was a battleground unlike any the world had ever seen. Its waters stretched vast and unforgiving, dotted with island chains whose names were unfamiliar to most Americans and Europeans before the war. Yet within months, places like Midway, Wake, and the Solomon Islands would be etched forever into the annals of history. To understand why Guadalcanal became the stage for one of the most ferocious campaigns of the Second World War, we must first retrace the steps of empire, ambition, and survival that led both the United States and Imperial Japan to this remote jungle-clad island. The road to Guadalcanal began not on its black volcanic sands, but in Tokyo, Honolulu, and Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, Japan struck a decisive blow, crippling much of the American Pacific Fleet. In the 6 months that followed, Japanese forces advanced with breathtaking speed, overrunning territories, from Burma to the Philippines, seizing Malaya and Singapore, and pushing deep into the Dutch East Indies. They claimed control over vital oil reserves, rubber plantations, and shipping lanes. It seemed for a moment that the rising sun would dominate all of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. For Japan, the strategy was simple in conception, but daring in execution: expand rapidly, establish defensive perimeters across the Pacific, and force the Allies to negotiate from a position of weakness. The gamble was enormous, but Tokyo believed that its warrior spirit, combined with meticulous planning and superior naval power, could withstand the industrial might of the United States. Yet hidden beneath this confidence was a fatal miscalculation: America's capacity to rebuild, reorganize, and strike back. By May of 1942, cracks began to show. The Battle of the Coral Sea had halted Japan's thrust toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. Though tactically inconclusive, the encounter marked the first time a Japanese advance had been checked. Then, in June, the tides shifted dramatically. At Midway, American carrier forces inflicted a crushing defeat, sinking 4 of Japan's fleet carriers in a matter of days. The Japanese Navy, once seen as invincible, had suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. The illusion of unstoppable conquest was shattered. But the story did not end with Midway. For Admiral Ernest King, the hard-driving chief of naval operations, Midway was not enough. He recognized that Japan still held a stranglehold on the Pacific, and unless the United States seized the initiative, Japan might regroup and fortify its positions. The next move, King argued, had to be bold. America must go on the offensive. It was then that the Solomon Islands emerged as the next critical theater. Stretching like a long chain of emerald beads across the ocean, the Solomons were strategically located between the United States supply lines to Australia and Japan's defensive perimeter. Control of the Solomons meant control of the sea lanes. It meant striking distance to New Guinea and ultimately a pathway to the Philippines. And within this chain of islands lay Guadalcanal, a name that, before the war, few outside the South Pacific had ever spoken aloud. In early 1942, Japanese engineers began construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast. Its purpose was chillingly clear. Once completed, Japanese aircraft could range far and wide, threatening Allied shipping routes between the United States and Australia. If left unchecked, it could sever the lifeline of men, weapons, and supplies flowing southward. American intelligence quickly realized the danger. Henderson Field, as it would later be known, had to be denied to the enemy. For President Franklin Roosevelt and his commanders, the decision was both strategic and symbolic. An American counterstroke in the Solomons would mark the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. It would test the Marines, the Navy, and the fledgling Army Air Forces in a crucible of combat unlike anything they had yet faced. Success would prove that Japan could be beaten not just defensively, as at Midway, but on the ground, in the jungles and rivers where men fought face to face. Yet the risks were staggering. America's Pacific Fleet was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers were precious, irreplaceable assets, and the United States had only a handful operational. Amphibious warfare on such a scale had never been attempted by American forces. Supplies were limited, and the tropical diseases of the South Pacific were as formidable an enemy as any Japanese division. Many in Washington doubted the wisdom of such a gamble so soon after Midway, but Roosevelt, King, and Admiral Chester Nimitz pressed ahead. Thus was born Operation Watchtower, the code name for the invasion of Guadalcanal. Marines, hastily trained and far from fully equipped, were gathered for a mission cloaked in secrecy. Few of them even knew where Guadalcanal was, much less what awaited them there. They were told only that they would be striking at the heart of Japan's perimeter, seizing an airfield that could change the balance of the Pacific War. As July 1942 drew to a close, transports and warships assembled in the waters of Fiji and New Caledonia. The invasion fleet, a patchwork of cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, was the largest amphibious task force yet mustered by the United States. Among the men aboard the transports, tension was palpable. Many were young Marines, scarcely out of high school, their weapons new, their uniforms stiff, their nerves tested only in training. Ahead of them lay the unknown, a jungle island, an unfinished airfield, and the expectation that the enemy would fight to the death to hold it. The road to Guadalcanal had been paved with ambition and blood. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, the Pacific had seen victories and losses on a colossal scale. Now, in August 1942, the stage was set for a new kind of battle, one not decided in a single day at sea, but in months of grinding attrition on land, in the skies, and across the restless waters of the Solomon Islands. The men of both nations were about to enter a campaign of unimaginable endurance, a struggle that would transform Guadalcanal from an obscure island into a symbol of defiance, sacrifice. To the untrained eye, the Solomon Islands seemed like little more than a scattering of green specks lost in the immensity of the Pacific. Remote, humid, and shrouded in thick jungle, they had little in the way of modern infrastructure, little contact with the outside world, and almost no recognition beyond their own shores. Yet in 1942, this chain of islands became one of the most fiercely contested prizes of the Second World War. The question was not what the islands were in themselves, but rather what they represented: control, supply, and the very future course of the Pacific War. Stretching in a long arc southeast of New Guinea, the Solomons formed a natural stepping stone across the ocean. To the north lay the great expanse of Micronesia and the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, a fortress bristling with aircraft and garrisons. To the south lay the Coral Sea and the lifeline to Australia. Whoever commanded the Solomons could dominate the sea lanes that threaded between these regions. In essence, the islands were a gateway, a bridge between hemispheres, and a dagger aimed at the heart of supply routes that kept Allied armies alive. For the Japanese, the Solomons were integral to a grand defensive perimeter. After the stunning victories of early 1942, Tokyo sought to consolidate its gains, creating a shield that would keep the Allies at bay while Japan fortified its empire. Bases were constructed in New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and throughout Micronesia. The Solomons, running like a spine down toward Australia, were vital to this strategy. They offered airfields from which bombers and fighters could launch deep, raids, and harbors where warships could anchor between operations. Most importantly, they provided a line from which Japan could threaten or sever the crucial link between the United States and its southern ally. Australia's position in the war cannot be overstated. For the United States, it was a forward base, a staging ground, and a partner whose survival was essential to the Allied cause. Men, equipment, and vast quantities of supplies flowed across the Pacific from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Pearl Harbor down to Brisbane and Sydney. From there, they were funneled northward into New Guinea and the islands beyond. If Japan could dominate the Solomons, it could choke these arteries of supply, isolating Australia, cutting it off from reinforcements, and forcing it into a position of peril. To Tokyo's strategists, this was not just advantageous, it was decisive. At the center of this vision lay Guadalcanal, the largest of the Solomon Islands. It was here, in mid-1942, that Japanese engineers began carving an airstrip from the flat plains along the northern coast. The location was not chosen at random. From Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could range across the Coral Sea, threatening Allied convoys and bases alike. Bombers based there could strike New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, and even reach the northern approaches of Australia itself. In effect, Guadalcanal was a springboard. Once complete, its airfield would extend Japanese power hundreds of miles. Farther south, drawing a curtain of danger across the Pacific lanes, American intelligence understood the danger immediately. Reports flowed in from coast watchers, brave Allied operatives and local islanders, who risked their lives to transmit coded messages from hidden outposts. Their reports painted a clear picture. Japanese forces were building something large, something permanent, on Guadalcanal. A new airfield, the Allies realized, was days or weeks from becoming operational. If Japanese bombers began to launch from there, every convoy, every troop ship, every resupply effort would sail under threat of sudden, devastating attack. The urgency of the situation resonated in Washington and Pearl Harbor. The United States could not afford to let Guadalcanal fall into enemy hands. Yet the broader significance of the Solomons went beyond mere logistics. To the Allies, seizing Guadalcanal meant more than neutralizing an airfield. It meant wresting control of an entire region that had, until then, been dominated by the rising sun. It meant pushing the Japanese back, island by island, along a corridor that led, eventually to Rabaul, and beyond Rabaul to the Philippines and Japan itself. The Solomons also presented a unique kind of battlefield. Unlike the deserts of North Africa or the cities of Europe, the islands were thick with rainforests, swollen rivers, and jagged coastlines. Supply lines would be fragile, terrain would be merciless, and disease would stalk. Every man who set foot there, malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers would prove as lethal as enemy fire. For both sides, the campaign would demand endurance as much as firepower. The environment itself was an enemy neither side could truly conquer. From a Japanese perspective, the Solomons were also tied to a sense of inevitability. Their victories had carried them across half the Pacific in months, but to secure those gains, they needed strongholds, bastions from which their fleet and aircraft could project force. Guadalcanal was not just a tactical decision, it was an emblem of their intent to fortify their empire. To abandon it without a fight would be to concede weakness, something the Japanese military ethos could scarcely imagine. For the Americans, however, the Solomons represented opportunity. Admiral Ernest King pressed the point with unrelenting vigor. The United States could no longer remain on the defensive. A strike at Guadalcanal would serve two purposes at once. It would safeguard supply routes to Australia, and it would mark the first true offensive of the Pacific War. Symbolism mattered. The morale of the American people, shaken by Pearl Harbor but uplifted by Midway, needed another victory, one that showed that American boys could not only defend but seize ground, hold it, and defeat the enemy face to face. The decision to strike the Solomons also marked a turning point in Allied cooperation. While the United States would lead the assault, Australian bases, ships, and airfields became indispensable. British and New Zealand's support, though stretched thin by the war in Europe, added to the Allied effort. For the first time, the war in the Pacific was becoming a coalition struggle, a fusion of resources, men, and determination against a common foe. And so, by July 1942, the Solomons had transformed from obscure islands to a fulcrum of strategy. For Japan, they were a shield. For America, they were a doorway. For both sides, they were essential to victory. Guadalcanal, once an island known only to its native inhabitants and a handful of colonial officials, now stood at the center of global conflict. Within weeks, it would become the focal point of a clash that would reverberate across the entire Pacific. The strategic importance of the Solomon Islands was no longer a matter of debate. It was a reality both sides understood with stark clarity, and it was this understanding that control of the Solomons could tip the balance of the war that propelled thousands of young men toward Guadalcanal shores. Ahead lay months of relentless fighting. But in July of 1942, as the decision was made to strike, the islands were still quiet. Jungle birds called, rivers flowed, and the unfinished airfield lay silent under the tropical sun. It was the calm before a storm unlike any the Pacific had ever known. In early 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the very pinnacle of its power. In the span of just 6 months, Japanese forces had accomplished what few thought possible. They had carved out an empire that stretched from the snowy peaks of northern China to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, from the remote islands of the Aleutians to the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun, emblazoned on ships, planes, and helmets, seemed to shine over half the Pacific. It was a zenith born of ambition, planning, and ruthless efficiency, and it carried with it the illusion of invincibility. The world had watched in astonishment as Japanese victories unfolded one after another. Pearl Harbor was the opening thunderclap, a strike so audacious that it stunned even seasoned observers of war. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, thought to be the shield of American power in the Pacific, had been left smoldering in a matter of hours. 8 battleships lay crippled or sunk, aircraft were destroyed in their hangars, and thousands of sailors and soldiers were dead or wounded. The attack announced to the world that Japan was no longer a regional power. It was a titan with global ambitions. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept through the Pacific with breathtaking momentum. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day of 1941, its British defenders overwhelmed. In January, Japanese troops stormed into Malaya, driving the British steadily southward toward Singapore. By February, Singapore itself, once hailed as the Gibraltar of the East, had capitulated, its surrender marking one of the darkest hours in British military history. Meanwhile, to the east, American forces in the Philippines were engaged in a desperate struggle to hold back the Japanese tide. General Douglas MacArthur's troops, outnumbered and undersupplied, fought valiantly on the Bataan Peninsula and at Corregidor. But by May 1942, starvation, disease, and relentless assault forced their surrender. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers fell into Japanese captivity, beginning the grim ordeal of the Bataan Death March. Further south, Japanese amphibious and airborne operations seized control of the Dutch East Indies, capturing vital oil reserves and rubber plantations. These resources were the lifeblood of modern warfare, and Tokyo now had them within its grasp. In Burma, Japanese divisions swept past British and Indian forces, threatening India itself. In New Guinea, they landed at Lae and Salamaua, moving ever closer to Australia. The scale of these victories was without precedent. In a matter of months, Japan had conquered an empire greater in size than that of Nazi Germany at its height. From Tokyo's perspective, the plan was working flawlessly. Their fleet, spearheaded by aircraft carriers, dominated the seas. Their armies, seasoned by years of war in China, were experienced, disciplined, and ferociously committed. Their air forces, flying the nimble Mitsubishi Zero, held superiority in the skies. To many Japanese officers, it seemed as though destiny itself had crowned them with triumph. This sense of invincibility was not just military but psychological. Propaganda extolled the virtues of the Japanese soldier, the indomitable spirit of Bushido, and the divine favor of the emperor. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated victory after victory, painting Japan as the liberator of Asia, casting out Western colonial powers, and raising the banner of a new Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. To millions across the empire, it appeared that Japan's moment had truly arrived. But behind the triumph lay shadows. Each victory came at a cost in men and material. The industrial base of Japan, while formidable, could not rival the sheer capacity of the United States. Its oil reserves, though replenished by conquest, were vulnerable to blockade. Its navy, though powerful, had taken losses at Coral Sea and was stretched thin across vast distances. And while Japanese troops fought with ferocity, they were often supplied by fragile, overextended logistics. Still, in the early months of 1942, such concerns seemed distant. To the Allies, the picture was bleak. Britain reeled from the loss of Singapore, its prestige shattered. The Dutch colonial empire in Asia had collapsed. Australia stood exposed, anxiously watching the skies and seas for the enemy's next move. The United States, though galvanized by Pearl Harbor, was still in the process of mobilization, its factories only beginning to roar into wartime production. For ordinary Americans reading newspapers or listening to radio broadcasts, the headlines were grim defeat in the Philippines, defeat in Malaya, defeat in the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun appeared unstoppable. It was at this moment, with Japan seemingly at the height of its power, that its leaders made critical decisions. Believing the United States could be cowed into negotiation, they sought to consolidate their gains, extending their defensive perimeter farther into the Pacific. Their sights turned toward New Guinea, the Solomons, and beyond. From these positions they could strike Australia, harass supply lines, and build the strongholds necessary to defend their vast new empire. For Tokyo, the construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal was not an afterthought. It was part of a larger design to secure dominance over the South Pacific, to place an iron curtain across Allied lifelines, and to prepare for the decisive battles that they believed would force the Americans to accept peace on Japanese terms. The Japanese High Command did not yet know that they had already crossed the threshold of their empire's greatest expansion. They did not see that their zenith was, in truth, the crest before the fall. The rising sun at its zenith burned brightly, casting long shadows over half the globe. But like all empires that reached too far, it carried within it the seeds of its undoing. For even as Japan celebrated its triumphs, the United States was gathering strength, its shipyards launching new carriers, its factories producing tanks, planes, and weapons at a scale beyond imagination. The world was watching, waiting for the next move in a war that was only beginning. And in the Solomons, on the island of Guadalcanal, the clash of ambitions was about to ignite a struggle that would test both nations to the limits of endurance. By July of 1942, the Allied war effort in the Pacific had reached a crossroads. The Japanese Empire stood at the height of its expansion, its soldiers and engineers, carving airstrips and bases across a vast arc of conquered territory. The Solomons were the newest link in that chain, and Guadalcanal, with its emerging airfield, posed a danger that American commanders could not ignore. Yet launching a counteroffensive so soon after Pearl Harbor and Midway was an audacious gamble, one that demanded boldness, secrecy, and improvisation on a scale the United States had never attempted before. This gamble would be known as Operation Watchtower. The origins of Watchtower lay in the tense conversations between the men who directed the Allied war. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, the steely and uncompromising chief of naval operations, pressed relentlessly for an immediate strike. King understood that hesitation would only give Japan time to fortify its new empire. He saw Guadalcanal not as a remote outpost, but as a spear pointed at Australia's heart. If Japan completed its airfield, Allied convoys ferrying men and supplies across the Pacific would sail under constant threat. To him there could be no delay. America had to attack. Across the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, weighed the risks. The U.S. Navy had emerged victorious at Midway, but its strength was fragile. Carriers were few, battleships crippled, and amphibious experience non-existent. The Marines had never attempted a landing on such a scale, and the Army was deeply engaged in Europe and North Africa. To launch an offensive in the Solomons meant stripping resources from other theaters and placing America's fledgling Pacific forces at the sharpest edge of danger. Yet Nimitz, like King, recognized the stakes. The Solomons could not be abandoned to the rising sun. The debate reached President Franklin Roosevelt, who, though focused on Europe as the priority theater, gave his blessing. He trusted his admirals, and he knew that the American public needed more than defensive victories. Pearl Harbor had been a wound, Midway had been a reprieve. Now, Roosevelt believed, the nation needed a counterstroke, something that proved America could seize the initiative, advance, and win. Operation Watchtower, risky though it was, became the order of the day. Planning began in haste. The target was Guadalcanal and the nearby islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Tulagi, with its natural harbor, was already garrisoned by Japanese troops. Guadalcanal's airfield was still under construction, but if captured, it could serve as a base for American aircraft, projecting power across the Solomons and shielding Allied supply lines. The objectives were clear: seize the airfield, destroy Japanese forces in the area, and establish a beachhead from which future offensives could be launched. The Marines were chosen as the spearhead. Under the command of Major General Alexander of Vandegrift, the One-Stone Marine Division became the core of the invasion force. Hastily assembled and inadequately trained for jungle warfare, these Marines were nonetheless expected to carry out the first major American amphibious landing of the war. Many were young recruits, barely months out of boot camp. Few had ever set foot outside the United States. Yet within weeks, they would find themselves fighting for survival in the fetid jungles of Guadalcanal. For the Navy, the challenge was immense. Amphibious doctrine existed in manuals and theory, but had never been tested under fire on such a scale. Transports had to be assembled, loaded, and escorted thousands of miles across the Pacific. Aircraft carriers would provide cover, but their vulnerability was terrifyingly clear after Coral Sea and Midway. Supply chains stretched back to bases in Fiji, New Caledonia, and beyond. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every pound of food had to be counted, packed, and guarded. The margin for error was razor thin. Secrecy was paramount. Few even knew the name Guadalcanal. Marines boarding transports in San Diego or Wellington were told only that they were heading for a Pacific Island operation. Maps were scarce. Some officers resorted to studying pre-war National Geographic charts. Training exercises were rushed. Equipment was incomplete. Jungle gear was virtually non-existent. In many ways, the Marines would be stepping into the unknown, armed with little more than their rifles, courage, and determination. The invasion force itself was formidable for its time, if improvised. The fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, included carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, as well as a screen of cruisers and destroyers. The transports, under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, carried nearly 19,000 Marines along with the supplies and artillery necessary to sustain them. Supporting the operation was Rear Admiral John M.C. Kane Sr., directing land-based aircraft from the South Pacific area. Together, this patchwork of naval power formed Task Force 61, the spear aimed at Guadalcanal. The risks were openly acknowledged. Japan's naval strength remained potent, its air power formidable. The Allies knew that Rabaul, only 560 miles away, bristled with Japanese aircraft and warships. Any landing at Guadalcanal would provoke an immediate and furious counterattack. Yet there was no alternative. To delay would allow the airfield to become operational. To wait for more training, more ships, more certainty, was to gamble with Australia's survival. And so the decision was made. The invasion would commence on August 7, 1942. As the task force gathered in the Fijian Islands for final preparations, the atmosphere was tense, a mixture of excitement and dread. Officers pored over charts, studying landing beaches and currents. Marines drilled in the basics of amphibious assault, clambering down. Cargo nets into landing craft, rehearsing under the tropical sun. Equipment was stowed, rifles cleaned, ammunition distributed. Chaplains offered prayers, while some men wrote hurried letters home, uncertain if they would ever return. For the Marines, the name Watchtower carried a strange irony. The mission was to seize a vantage point, a foothold from which the Allies could survey and control the South Pacific. Yet for the men about to storm Guadalcanal, it felt more like stepping into the dark, climbing a tower without knowing what awaited at the top. Rumors circulated about Japanese ferocity, about the unforgiving jungle, about the diseases that stalked the islands. Still, the orders were clear, and the die had been cast. Operation Watchtower was not only the first American offensive of the Pacific War, it was also a test of will. Could the United States, still reeling from humiliation and loss, summon the strength to strike back? Could Green Marines and an overstretched Navy endure the crucible of jungle warfare, supply shortages, and a determined enemy? Could the Allies turn the tide of a war that, until then, had been dominated by Japanese triumphs? In late July, as the task force slipped from its anchorage and turned northward toward the Solomons. The answers to those questions lay ahead, hidden in the thick jungles of Guadalcanal. The great gamble had begun. The planners had done what they could. Now, the outcome rested with the men who would land on the beaches, seize the airfield, and fight for every foot of ground. The countdown to August 7 had started, and with it, the opening chapter of one of the most decisive campaigns in modern history. The morning of August 7, 1942, was humid and thick with the smells of salt water and burning fuel as the vast American invasion force gathered just off the Solomon Islands. After weeks of hurried planning, fierce debates, and desperate improvisation, the United States was about to launch its first major offensive against the Empire of Japan. The target was a relatively obscure place on the map, the island of Guadalcanal, together with neighboring Tulagi and the small islets that surrounded it. Yet, in the months to come, this place would become synonymous with blood, endurance, and a shifting tide in the Pacific War. The American fleet, a powerful armada of transports, cruisers, and carriers, steamed into position under the command of Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who oversaw carrier air support, and Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the amphibious commander tasked with delivering the Marines to shore. For the men of the One Stone Marine Division, under the leadership of Major General Alexander Vandegrift, the sight of the looming coastline was both exhilarating and terrifying. Many of them were green, fresh recruits who had never faced live combat. They had drilled endlessly in the heat of the South Pacific, but the thought of storming enemy territory was something else entirely. Tulagi and the smaller islands were the first objectives. These outposts had been fortified by Japanese forces and offered a staging point for patrol craft, seaplanes, and intelligence gathering. The Marines descended upon them with ferocity. The fighting was brutal, conducted at close quarters in thick jungle and broken coral terrain. On Tulagi, Japanese defenders resisted fanatically, employing caves, bunkers, and suicidal charges. By the end of the struggle, virtually the entire Japanese garrison had been annihilated. Only a handful chose surrender, while hundreds fought to the death. The Marines paid in blood as well, but they had secured the islets and demonstrated that they could match Japanese soldiers in ferocity and grit. Meanwhile, the main landings on Guadalcanal itself unfolded under a strangely eerie quiet. The Marines, expecting heavy opposition, braced themselves for machine gun nests and shell fire as their Higgins boats churned through the surf toward the beaches. But when they leapt onto the sand, they found the shoreline deserted. The Japanese had not dug in here with infantry divisions. Instead, they had left behind construction troops and laborers, men tasked with completing the nearly finished airstrip at Lunga Point, an airfield that would soon bear the name Henderson Field. The Marines quickly realized they had stumbled upon a priceless opportunity. The Japanese had withdrawn most of their combat troops inland, or left them thinly dispersed. The beachhead was secured with astonishing ease, and within hours, waves of American Marines were unloading supplies, artillery, and vehicles. Yet beneath the relief was a sense of unease. The stillness of the jungle, the absence of strong resistance, seemed to suggest a storm was gathering beyond their sight. As the Marines pressed inland, they seized large stockpiles of Japanese food, equipment, and even whiskey left behind in the hurried retreat. But what mattered most was the airstrip. Its runways, though incomplete, represented the heart of Japanese plans to project power deep into the Pacific and threaten the supply lanes between America and Australia. Capturing it so swiftly was a coup of enormous strategic value. General Vandegrift knew this immediately. The defense and completion of that airfield would become the central purpose of his campaign. Still, the first days of the landing were fraught with logistical chaos. Supplies piled haphazardly on the beaches. Ammunition and rations sat exposed, vulnerable to weather and potential enemy airstrikes. The Marines lacked sufficient transport vehicles to move equipment quickly inland, and confusion reigned as units tried to sort themselves amid the oppressive heat. Worse, the naval commanders remained wary. Fletcher, commanding the precious aircraft carriers, worried about Japanese air and naval counterattacks. On August 9th, he abruptly decided to withdraw his carriers, leaving the transports and Marines without adequate air cover. This decision would soon prove costly. On the night of August 8 to 9, as the Marines consolidated their beachhead and pushed to secure Henderson Field, the Japanese struck back in the waters just offshore. In what would be remembered as the Battle of Savo Island, a Japanese cruiser force surprised and overwhelmed Allied warships, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and inflicting one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. The sea was left littered with burning wreckage, oil, and bodies. For the Marines ashore, the thunder of distant gunfire and the glow of flames on the horizon served as a grim reminder. They were now alone, lightly supplied, and facing the wrath of an enemy determined to reclaim what had been lost. Yet despite the naval disaster, the landings themselves stood as an undeniable achievement. The Marines had established a foothold on Guadalcanal. They had secured the unfinished airstrip, soon to be renamed Henderson Field. They had driven the Japanese from Tulagi and neighboring islets, eliminating valuable enemy bases, and they had demonstrated, to themselves as much as to their superiors, that the Japanese could be challenged, beaten, and forced to retreat. For the men on the ground, the real struggle was only beginning. Ahead lay months of savage combat, isolation, hunger, disease, and unrelenting attacks. But in those first days, as the stars and stripes were planted in the soil of Guadalcanal, a new chapter of the Pacific War opened. America had moved from defense to offense. The soldiers who had splashed ashore in August 1942 did not yet know how much would be demanded of them or how high the price would be. But history would remember those landings as the moment when the tide of the Pacific began, however slowly and painfully, to turn. The morning of August 7, 1942, broke with a strange and heavy silence over the dark waters of the Solomon Islands. In the early hours, long before the sun's first rays touched the horizon, the assembled fleet of Allied warships lay in formation, their hulking silhouettes a shadowy armada. Within their holds, thousands of United States Marines, many young, inexperienced and untested in battle, waited in anxious stillness. Their mission was as audacious as it was dangerous, to land on the island of Guadalcanal and wrest from the Japanese the airfield they had begun constructing on its northern shore. The Marines, members of the newly christened One Stone Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandegrift, had been drilled in amphibious operations, but had never attempted an assault on such a scale. As they prepared themselves for the unknown, the air was filled with the low rumble of naval guns being readied. At precisely 6:13 a.m., that silence shattered. Allied warships opened fire, their shells arcing through the pre-dawn gloom before slamming into the shoreline. The thunder of the bombardment rolled across the waters, mingling with the crashing surf and the growing roar of naval aircraft overhead. To many Marines, the spectacle seemed overwhelming, the sheer force of American firepower giving the impression that nothing could survive such destruction. Yet hidden in the jungle, the Japanese defenders braced themselves, determined to resist. As dawn rose higher, the Marines clambered down rope ladders into waiting. Higgins boats, the iconic landing craft that would carry them to shore. The sea was restless, the swell rocking the small boats as they crowded together before forming into waves for the assault. In every craft, the men were silent, their knuckles white on their rifles and their minds, turning over questions they dared not voice. Would the Japanese contest the beach? Would the artillery barrage be enough? Would they live to see another day? When the first landing waves touched the shore near Lunga Point, the Marines braced for machine gun fire, for mortars, for the familiar deadly greeting of a fortified beachhead. But none came. Instead, the beaches were eerily quiet. Cautiously, they moved inland, rifles raised, expecting at any moment to be cut down. But the Japanese garrison had not chosen to defend the beaches. Shockingly, many of the Marines found abandoned huts, scattered equipment, and only a thin line of opposition. It was as if the defenders had vanished into the dense jungle beyond. Relief coursed through the landing force, but it was tempered by unease. The silence was deceptive. The Marines knew they had stepped into a deadly trap that would spring in its own time. By mid-morning, more waves of Marines had come ashore. They secured a wide beachhead and began pushing inland toward their main objective, the airfield. The site was a scar on the landscape, a broad stretch of cleared ground, where Japanese engineers had begun construction only months earlier. The Marines advanced through patches of kunai grass and half-finished revetments, finding bulldozers, fuel drums, and scattered construction equipment. It was a surreal sight, the enemy's labor interrupted, their ambition laid bare. The airfield, later to be named Henderson Field after Major Lofton. R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway, was nearly complete. For the Americans, this was a prize of immeasurable value. From this strip of land, they could project air power across the Solomons, threaten the sea lanes to Australia, and begin rolling back Japanese expansion. While one force secured Guadalcanal itself, Marines landed on the smaller neighboring islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Unlike Guadalcanal's beaches, these landings were met with fierce resistance. Japanese defenders fought from caves, bunkers, and fortified positions, turning the jungle and rocky terrain into death traps. The fighting was bitter, up close and personal. Bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers became the grim tools of battle. On Gavutu, the 1 Stone Marine Parachute Battalion faced heavy casualties as they tried to root out fanatical Japanese holdouts. On Tulagi, Marines moved house by house, their progress slowed by ambushes and desperate counterattacks. By the time these smaller islands were secured, the Marines understood a chilling truth: the Japanese would not surrender. They would fight to the last man. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines set to work fortifying their positions around the airfield. Supplies were unloaded from transports as quickly as possible, stacked along the beaches in precarious piles. Engineers began finishing the airstrip, knowing that Japanese aircraft from Rabaul would soon target it with relentless raids. Already, the distant rumble of Japanese bombers could be heard, and soon their engines filled the skies. Waves of enemy planes descended on the landing beaches, strafing and bombing, sending Marines diving for cover as anti-aircraft guns barked furiously from Allied ships. The message was unmistakable. The Japanese were not gone, nor were they defeated. They were watching, waiting, preparing their counterstroke. That first night on Guadalcanal was restless. The jungle pulsed with strange sounds, insects chirping, leaves rustling, and, more ominously, the muffled movements of unseen figures. Japanese patrols probed the marine perimeter. Snipers harassed isolated outposts, and rumors spread through the ranks of enemy infiltration. The Marines, many still shaken by their first taste of combat, clutched their rifles tightly, their nerves frayed by the darkness. For every man, the realization was sinking in: this would not be a quick campaign. Guadalcanal would demand everything they had, and perhaps more. As the sun rose on August 8th, the airfield was firmly in American hands, but the struggle for the island was only beginning. The Marines had achieved the first successful American offensive landing of the war in the Pacific, a bold and historic moment. Yet even as they dug foxholes and strung barbed wire, events beyond their control were already conspiring against them. The Japanese, enraged by the sudden invasion, were gathering their strength. Soon the Marines would face not just scattered resistance, but the full fury of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. The first steps on Guadalcanal had been taken, but the long, brutal road lay ahead. The morning of August 7, 1942, dawned with a tension unlike any other. For months, the Pacific had been dominated by the rising tide of Japanese victories. Island after island had fallen, and the defensive perimeter of the empire stretched deep into the ocean. Now, for the first time, the United States was about to strike back with an offensive of its own. The chosen battlefield was a relatively obscure island, thick with jungle, ringed by reefs, and scarcely known to the men who would soon storm its shores. Its name, Guadalcanal. As the blackness of night gave way to first light, the waters of the Solomon Islands shimmered with the silhouettes of an immense armada. Dozens of transport ships, their decks stacked with landing craft, formed the backbone of the operation. Around them moved the great guardians of the fleet, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, standing ready to deliver fire and steel upon the enemy. It was an invasion on a scale few of these Marines had ever witnessed. The code name for this bold strike was Operation Watchtower. On board the troop transports, young Marines tightened the straps of their helmets and checked their rifles. Many were little more than boys, farmers, clerks, mechanics, thrust into the role of shock troops at the tip of America's spear. Sweat clung to their brows despite the early hour. Around them, chaplains offered final prayers, and letters were folded neatly into pockets. Words, written in trembling script to sweethearts and mothers thousands of miles away. For most, it was their first taste of combat. The target was clear: seize Guadalcanal and Tulagi to deny the Japanese their forward air bases. Intelligence had revealed that the Japanese were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal, a potential dagger pointed at the lifeline between the United States and Australia. If completed, enemy bombers could sever the supply routes, strangling Allied hopes of mounting further offensives. The airfield had to be captured, whatever the cost. At precisely 6 a.m., the roar of naval gunfire shattered the stillness. Cruisers and destroyers opened their batteries, hurling explosive shells toward the jungle-covered shoreline. The earth convulsed under the pounding. Trees erupted in flame, and thick smoke curled skyward. For those watching from the decks of the transports, it seemed inconceivable that anything could survive such a barrage. The jungle, once dense and green, was ripped apart in cascades of fire. But as the echoes of the bombardment faded, silence crept back over the beaches. To the Marines it felt ominous, unnatural. Where was the enemy? They had been told to expect resistance, machine gun nests, artillery, and snipers. Yet the shoreline appeared deserted. "Stand by," came the order, and with a mechanical clatter, landing craft splashed into the water, lowering away from the transport ships. Marines clambered down rope ladders into the waiting boats, clutching their rifles close. The sea was choppy, and many became sick as the small craft bobbed and rolled, packed tight with men and gear. Ahead, the coastline grew nearer, every eye straining to spot muzzle flashes in the tree line. The first wave hit the beaches of Guadalcanal near mid-morning. Boots splashed into the surf, rifles raised as the Marines surged forward. The expectation of enemy fire weighed heavily on them, but it never came. Instead, they were met with eerie silence. No Japanese defenders opposed their landing. No machine gun fire ripped through their ranks. Instead, the Marines fanned out cautiously across the sand, rifles at the ready, waiting for the ambush that never materialized. The truth soon emerged. The Japanese, caught off guard by the sudden American assault, had abandoned their positions near the beaches. The construction workers and soldiers responsible for building the airfield had fled inland at the first signs of naval bombardment, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and half-completed structures. The Marines moved inland swiftly, bewildered by their unexpected fortune. By afternoon, the American flag was raised above the ridges overlooking the shore. It was a symbolic moment, the first time since Pearl Harbor that U.S. forces had seized enemy-held ground in the Pacific. For the Marines who watched the Stars and Stripes rise, it was a surge of pride, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. As Marines pushed deeper into the jungle, they discovered the Japanese airstrip. Bulldozers sat abandoned, earth movers left idle, and stacks of supplies lay scattered in disarray. The runway was only partially complete, but it was immediately clear how valuable this site would become. In a matter of days, American engineers would finish what the Japanese had begun, transforming the strip into Henderson Field, the critical lifeline that would anchor the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Yet even amid this triumph, shadows loomed. While the landings on Guadalcanal were strangely unopposed, the nearby island of Tulagi told a different story. There, Marines faced fierce resistance. Japanese defenders dug into caves and bunkers, fought with a ferocity that shocked the Americans. They refused to surrender, launching suicidal counterattacks even when hopelessly outnumbered. The fighting on Tulagi was savage, hand-to-hand, bayonet to bayonet, and it foreshadowed the brutal nature of the campaign to come. Back on Guadalcanal, the sense of unease deepened. The Marines had secured the beachhead and the airfield, but the jungle pressed in all around them, dense, humid, and alive with unseen dangers. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a twig set nerves on edge. They knew the Japanese had not fled the island entirely. Somewhere beyond the tree line, enemy soldiers were regrouping, watching, and waiting. As night fell on that first day, the skies over Guadalcanal blazed with a spectacular but terrifying sight. Japanese bombers flying from Rabaul screamed down upon the invasion fleet. The attack was swift, precise, and deadly. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in reply, tracers arcing across the darkened skies. Ships maneuvered frantically, columns of water erupting around them as bombs plunged into the sea. The Marines on shore could only watch as the naval battle unfolded, realizing, with sinking hearts, that their position was not as secure as it seemed. By the end of that night, the Marines held the beaches and the half-completed airfield, but the Japanese were already moving to strike back. The landings at Guadalcanal had been astonishingly successful, but they were only the opening act. The struggle for this island, and the fate of the Pacific, was about to become one of the most desperate contests of the war. The night of August 8, 1942, settled heavily over the waters off Guadalcanal. The sea was calm, the air damp and heavy with tropical heat, and above the southern stars glittered in silence. To the untrained eye, it was a tranquil scene, but beneath that still surface lay the prelude to one of the most devastating naval defeats ever suffered by the United States Navy, a calamity that would be remembered as the Battle of Savo Island. The Allied landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi had begun only a day before. Marines now dug into their precarious beachheads while construction crews hurried to secure Henderson Field. Offshore, the covering fleet of cruisers and destroyers maintained vigilant watch over the waters, guarding the vulnerable transports unloading supplies. Yet confidence, even complacency, had crept into the Allied command. The Japanese, it was assumed, would not strike so swiftly, nor so boldly. That assumption would prove tragically mistaken. Far to the north, steaming down from Rabaul under the cloak of darkness, came Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force. It was a powerful, disciplined squadron, 7 cruisers and a single destroyer, veterans of earlier campaigns, their hulls cutting through the black water with silent precision. Mikawa was a cautious man, but on this night he sensed opportunity. The American and Australian fleets lay divided, their patrols scattered, their attention fixed on supporting the landings ashore. In the Admiral's mind, the stage was set for a sudden, crushing blow. Shortly after midnight, Mikawa's ships slipped undetected through the channel west of Savo Island, a brooding volcanic cone that loomed like a sentinel over the surrounding waters. A line of Allied destroyers was supposed to guard the northern and southern approaches, but radar was primitive, coordination poor, and crews weary from long days of operations. Worse still, some watch crews believed the risk of attack minimal, lulled by the illusion of Allied naval superiority. In that critical hour, vigilance faltered. The Japanese struck with terrifying swiftness. At 1:43 a.m., searchlights cut open the darkness, and the night erupted in flame. Mikawa's cruisers unleashed full broadsides of shells and long-range torpedoes, the dreaded long lances, whose reach and power far exceeded anything the Allies possessed. Allied ships, caught off guard and silhouetted against the faint glow of the island horizon, became instant targets. The Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra was among the first to be hit, shells tearing into her engine rooms and setting her ablaze. Within minutes, she was a crippled wreck, her decks strewn with dead and wounded. Nearby, the American heavy cruiser USS Chicago took torpedoes to her bow, staggered, and fell out of line. Panic rippled through the Allied formation as the Japanese gunners shifted fire with chilling accuracy. Then came the hammer blows. The heavy cruiser USS Vincennes was illuminated in the searchlight beams, and Japanese shells smashed into her superstructure, igniting fires that raged uncontrollably. USS Astoria, desperate to return fire, was likewise engulfed in flames as salvo after salvo ripped into her hull. USS Quincy, caught in the maelstrom, was raked by torpedoes and shells, her decks a storm of fire and twisted steel. In the space of less than an hour, 3 proud American cruisers were mortally wounded, burning brightly against the night sky like funeral pyres upon the sea. The ocean itself seemed to reflect the horror. Fiery wrecks drifted helplessly, the glow of their flames casting ghastly light across the dark water. Men abandoned ship, plunging into the sea slicked with oil and lit by burning debris. The cries of the wounded and drowning carried across the night as sharks, drawn by the carnage, began their silent feeding. For those struggling in the blackness, survival became a desperate race against exhaustion and fear. Yet even in this moment of devastating triumph, Mikawa faltered, fearing that daylight would bring devastating American airstrikes from Henderson Field. He chose not to press his advantage against the nearby transports. With hundreds of Marines ashore depending on those ships, their destruction might have crippled the entire Guadalcanal operation. But Mikawa, cautious by nature, turned his ships back toward Rabaul, leaving the Allied supply fleet untouched. It was a decision that spared the American foothold, though at the cost of his opportunity for total victory. By dawn, the wreckage was plain to see. The waters around Savo Island were littered with drifting bodies, charred lifeboats, and the shattered hulks of proud warships. The United States Navy had suffered its worst-ever defeat at sea, losing 4 heavy cruisers and over 1,000 men in a single night. The survivors, many clinging to rafts or floating wreckage, bore haunted expressions. Men who had seen fire, steel, and death descend in an instant. For the Allies, the shock was profound. The myth of easy superiority over the Imperial Navy had been shattered. The Pacific was no longer a theater where numbers alone guaranteed victory. Discipline, training, and readiness had to be paid for in blood. For the Japanese, the battle was a tactical triumph but a strategic failure. Their ships had struck hard but left the decisive target, Henderson Field and its lifeline of transports, intact. The Battle of Savo Island was a grim lesson written in fire and salt water, a warning that the campaign for Guadalcanal would be long, brutal, and unforgiving. The seas around that volcanic island, once calm under the stars, had become a graveyard of steel, a place where courage and complacency met, and where the balance of power in the Pacific hung by a thread dot in war. Battles are not won only on fields or in the skies. They are won, and just as often lost, in the long shadows of supply. At Guadalcanal, the struggle for resupply became a contest as fierce as the firefights in the jungle or the dogfights above the island. Here, on this remote outpost of the Solomon Chain, the outcome of the campaign hinged upon the ability of both the Japanese and the Americans to keep men fed, guns supplied, and fuel flowing across the restless waters. For the Japanese, the answer came in the form of speed, audacity, and improvisation. Their solution earned a name that would become infamous in naval history: the Tokyo Express. Each night, sleek destroyers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, slipped through the slot of the Solomon Islands under the cover of darkness. They moved swiftly, like predators in the night, their hulls cutting through the black waters as though they were extensions of the sea itself. Their mission was to deliver men, supplies, and reinforcements onto the contested shores of Guadalcanal. But destroyers were not designed to carry crates of food, barrels of fuel, or boxes of ammunition. They were designed to fight, to hunt, to unleash torpedoes with devastating effect. And so, the Japanese adapted. Drums of rice, tinned food, ammunition, and even medical supplies were lashed together in makeshift rafts, dropped into the sea, and pushed toward shore, where soldiers waiting in the shallows hauled them onto the beaches. It was a desperate improvisation, and often the surf claimed more than it gave. Supplies sank, spoiled, or were swept out to sea. Many a soldier opened a long-awaited crate, only to find its contents ruined by salt water or split open on the reef. And yet the Japanese pressed on. Every night, the Tokyo Express thundered through the slot, destroyers, racing at maximum speed, dodging the long-range American patrols. The Imperial Navy commanders knew the risks. Every sortie exposed their ships to ambush, to submarine attack, to sudden bombardment from American cruisers lurking in the dark. Still, they accepted the danger, for without supplies, the men on Guadalcanal would wither. For the Americans, the supply struggle took a different form. They relied on cargo ships and slow transports, heavily laden with food, ammunition, aviation fuel, and heavy equipment. These vessels were the backbone of the Allied logistical chain, but they were lumbering, vulnerable, and painfully slow. To protect them, destroyers and cruisers formed escorts, but the risk remained immense. Every voyage into the waters around Guadalcanal became a gamble, a test of nerves, and often a fight to the death. In broad daylight, American supply ships were easy prey for Japanese bombers, which swooped from Rabaul to unleash sudden fury. By night, those same convoys risked being torn apart by prowling Japanese cruisers and destroyers. A single successful raid could send thousands of tons of vital material to the bottom. And yet, without these convoys, Henderson Field, the vital airstrip on Guadalcanal, would fall silent, its aircraft grounded for want of fuel and spare parts. The strain on American logistics was visible in every foxhole and every mess line. Marines often found themselves rationed to the bare minimum, hard biscuits, tinned meat, and coffee stretched thin. For weeks at a time, fresh supplies failed to reach the beaches, leaving men gaunt and exhausted. Hunger gnawed as cruelly as bullets, and disease spread in the absence of proper medicine. The jungle became a second enemy, feeding on scarcity. Meanwhile, the Japanese soldiers who did reach Guadalcanal aboard the Tokyo Express were often as undernourished as their foes. Rice became a precious commodity, and many subsisted on meager portions, supplementing their diet with coconuts, roots, or whatever the island's meager resources could provide. As the weeks wore on, their bodies weakened, even as their resolve to retake the island hardened. But the Japanese method of resupply carried another hidden cost. Each night that destroyers were tasked with supply runs was a night they were not free to engage in offensive operations. These fast, deadly ships, designed for torpedo attacks and fleet battles, were diverted from their intended purpose, burdened by cargo instead of war. Thus, the Tokyo Express was both a lifeline and a drain, a measure of necessity, but also a sign of desperation. The Americans, too, paid dearly for their convoys. Time and again, transports were caught and destroyed before they could unload. Naval escorts fought fiercely, but the losses mounted. Still, the U.S. had one advantage that time would only deepen: industrial strength. Each ship lost was, in theory, replaceable. New transports, new cargo vessels, new escorts. These could be built, dispatched, and eventually deployed. The Japanese, with far fewer resources and industrial capacity, had no such luxury. As the weeks turned to months, the lifeline of supply defined the Guadalcanal campaign. Each crate that made it ashore, each barrel of fuel, each box of ammunition, prolonged the struggle and shaped the battles to come. Henderson Field roared to life on the days when supply convoys succeeded, its aircraft taking to the skies with renewed vigor. Conversely, when supply faltered, the island seemed to hold its breath, every man on the ground knowing that tomorrow's fight might be fought with dwindling strength. In this war of attrition, the ocean was no neutral backdrop. It was a battlefield as decisive as any jungle clearing or coral ridge. For in the South Pacific, control of supply meant control of survival itself. The Tokyo Express and the American convoys became symbols of this truth, two lifelines stretched thin across dangerous waters, both strained to their breaking points by the relentless demands of the Guadalcanal campaign. The waters of the Solomon Islands became known to sailors as the Slot, a long, narrow sea corridor running between the islands of the archipelago, from the northern approaches of Bougainville all the way down to Guadalcanal. For months, this maritime highway would serve as the lifeline for both armies. Supplies, reinforcements, and the very survival of men on both sides depended on which navy could exert dominance over this narrow passage. What unfolded here was not a single decisive engagement, but rather a grueling series of night battles, ambushes, and hit-and-run clashes that turned the Slot into one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the Pacific War. For the Japanese, mastery of the Slot was essential. Their fast destroyers, adept at slipping through the islands under cover of darkness, delivered reinforcements, food, and ammunition to the embattled garrisons on Guadalcanal. The Americans, however, knew that if these convoys were not checked, the Japanese could steadily rebuild their strength and threaten Henderson Field, the airstrip whose possession had become the pivot of the entire campaign. Thus, night after night, the two navies probed, feinted, and clashed in a grim battle of attrition. Unlike the larger fleet battles of the Coral Sea or Midway, the confrontations in the Slot were close-quarters affairs. They often took place under the cover of moonlight or in pitch-black darkness where visibility was measured in mere yards, and survival hinged upon radar, nerves, and split-second decision-making. For the Americans, new radar technology provided an edge, allowing them to detect Japanese formations at distances far greater than the human eye could see. But the Japanese veterans of night fighting countered with skillful tactics honed through years of training, as well as the devastating power of their long lance torpedoes, ordnance that could strike from distances and at speeds no American torpedo could match. The rhythm of these clashes soon developed into a deadly pattern. American cruisers and destroyers would patrol the slot at night, often in formations designed to intercept Japanese supply runs. The Japanese in turn would race down the channel with their destroyers loaded with troops and supplies, seeking to dash past the American screens. When battle was joined, the night would erupt in sudden violence, the roar of naval guns, the streaking trails of torpedoes slicing across the water, the blinding bursts of explosions as ships were struck and torn apart. Some nights the Americans prevailed, sinking Japanese transports before they could reach Guadalcanal. On other nights, it was the Japanese who triumphed, slipping through the blockade to deliver reinforcements or ambushing Allied ships with deadly precision. Each side adapted constantly, learning from mistakes, adjusting tactics, and improvising strategies. For every victory there was a counterblow, for every advance, a setback. It was a chess match, played with steel, fire, and blood, and the waters of the slot became littered with the wreckage of ships and the bodies of sailors. For the crews who fought in these battles, the experience was harrowing. Long hours of tense silence, scanning the dark horizon for signs of an enemy, were suddenly shattered by moments of utter chaos. Ships would blaze into fire, crews would struggle to contain flooding or extinguish. Flames and comrades would be hurled into the sea as their vessels sank beneath them. Survivors often spoke of the eerie quiet that followed such battles, the wreckage drifting on black waters, the cries of men echoing across the waves, the haunting glow of burning ships lighting the night. Despite the ferocity of these encounters, neither side could claim outright dominance in the slot. The Japanese retained their ability to slip supplies through under cover of darkness, though at growing cost. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained their determination to challenge every passage, ensuring that Japanese reinforcements never arrived unmolested. Over time, attrition began to tilt the balance. For Japan, the loss of seasoned destroyer crews and the wear on their ships weakened their ability to sustain the Tokyo Express. For the United States, the steady arrival of reinforcements and replacement ships strengthened their grip on the Solomons. The battles of the slot were more than just a series of skirmishes. They were the heartbeat of the Guadalcanal campaign. They reflected the larger struggle unfolding on land and in the skies, a contest, not of single grand battles but of endurance, persistence, and willpower. In these waters, strategy became a nightly gamble, where luck, skill, and courage determined survival. And as the months dragged on, the cumulative weight of these clashes would shape the fate of Guadalcanal itself. The slot thus stands as a symbol of the grinding naval war in the Solomons, a place where neither side could retreat, where every mile of ocean carried strategic consequence, and where the outcome of countless small battles slowly decided the fate of an entire campaign. When the Marines first hacked out a clearing in the red clay of Guadalcanal, they could not have foreseen that the modest strip of pierced steel planking would soon become the most fiercely contested airfield in the Pacific. Henderson Field, as it was named, was nothing more than a rough runway carved from jungle, fringed by palm trees, and guarded by makeshift bunkers and foxholes. Yet from this precarious foothold emerged an aerial fighting force whose very existence would shape the battle for Guadalcanal. It came to be called the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for the island. Cactus. The men who flew from Henderson were a patchwork collection of aviators drawn from the U.S. Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Army Air Forces. They were united not by uniform but by a singular mission: to deny the skies to the Japanese and to protect the fragile lifeline of American troops and supplies below. Their aircraft were equally varied. Marine pilots brought in their rugged Grumman F-4F Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers. The Navy supplemented with additional Wildcats and torpedo planes whenever carriers could spare them. The Army contributed its long-legged P-400 Airacobras, export versions of the P-30, 9 originally intended for Britain but diverted to the South Pacific. These fighters, though maligned for their limitations, were flown with valor in the unforgiving skies above Guadalcanal. Conditions at Henderson Field were harsh in the extreme. Pilots lived in tents or crude huts, the ground soaked with tropical rain or scorched by equatorial sun. Food was often little more than tinned rations. Malaria stalked the camps relentlessly, thinning the ranks as surely as enemy fire. Planes were repaired under palm fronds and with whatever spare parts could be scrounged from wrecks or supply convoys that managed to run the gauntlet of Japanese warships. Fuel was precious, ammunition more so. Every sortie was weighed against the resources it consumed, for the thin margin of supply could not be wasted. Despite these hardships, the aviators of the Cactus Air Force forged a reputation for tenacity and ferocity. Japanese bombers and fighters flew daily raids from Rabaul and the northern bases, intent on smashing Henderson Field into silence. Yet the defenders rose to meet them time and again. Wildcats clawed upward to intercept Mitsubishi Zeros, dueling in spirals and diving attacks. The slower P-400 seconds, unable to climb high enough to meet enemy bombers at altitude, instead waited to pounce on stragglers or flew dangerous ground, support missions for the Marines. Dauntless dive, bombers, veterans of Midway, roared off the strip to strike Japanese ships. In the slot, the narrow waters north of Guadalcanal that had become a killing ground. The airfield itself was under constant pressure. Bomb craters pocked its length, yet bulldozers and sweating Seabees filled them before the next raid. Each takeoff carried the risk of disaster as Japanese artillery occasionally ranged. Shells onto the strip and sniper fire from lurking infiltrators echoed at its edges. Even when planes managed to get airborne, they often returned riddled with holes, limping in with hydraulic systems shot out or engines coughing their last. Landings were perilous affairs, sometimes with landing gear frozen, sometimes on bare fuselage, skidding across the clay as ground crews rushed forward to pull the pilot free. But for all the losses, the Cactus Air Force achieved what was unthinkable at the battle's outset. It wrested daylight control of the skies from the Japanese. By day, American and Allied transports could, at great risk, bring supplies into the island. By day, Marines could fight with some assurance that bombers would not obliterate their lines unchecked. And by day, Japanese shipping found itself harried and bloodied whenever it dared approach too boldly. The Japanese, for their part, respected and feared the defenders of Henderson. Their bombers began to suffer crippling losses on daylight raids, forced eventually to shift to nocturnal harassment instead. The vaunted Zero fighters discovered that while their machines were faster and more agile, the determination of American pilots, fighting close to their own lines, guided by primitive radar and bolstered by a fierce will to hold, leveled the balance. The skies over Guadalcanal became a crucible where rookie pilots grew seasoned in. Days and veterans endured a grind of combat that tested both nerves and flesh. Every victory was costly. Pilots sometimes returned to find comrades' tents empty, their bunks already stripped, for the losses were constant. Yet the Cactus Air Force endured. It endured when supplies were nearly gone, when malaria drained men of their strength, and when Japanese attacks seemed unending. Its persistence became a symbol for the entire Guadalcanal campaign, a stubborn refusal to yield, no matter the odds. By late 1942, Henderson Field was no longer merely a patch of dirt. It was the anvil on which the struggle for the Solomon Islands was hammered. The roar of wildcats lifting off, the shriek of dauntless dive, bombers plunging into the sea, the desperate dogfights. Overhead, all of these became daily rhythms, the soundscape of a battle that defined the Pacific War's turning point. The Cactus Air Force had been born of necessity, sustained by courage, and immortalized by its defense of a jungle airstrip that held the fate of a campaign, and perhaps the war itself, in its orbit. The skies above Guadalcanal became an arena of constant trial, where men wrestled with death at the controls of machines pushed to their limits. Every dawn and every dusk, the distant hum of engines carried with it both promise and peril, for in those fragile aluminum frames rested not just individual lives, but the fate of the campaign itself. Above the steaming jungles, above the waters of Ironbottom Sound, American and Japanese aviators fought, duels of skill and will, their encounters shaping the very tempo of the battle for the island. At the heart of these contests were two machines, each embodying the philosophies, strengths, and weaknesses of the nations that built them. On one side stood the Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's vaunted fighter, a symbol of technological prowess and martial spirit. Sleek, Lightweight and unmatched in maneuverability, the Zero had earned its fearsome reputation in the early months of the Pacific War. Pilots who first faced it described its uncanny ability to turn inside any opponent, climbing like a hawk, diving with fluid grace, and seemingly dancing through the air with effortless control. Its long range extended the Japanese reach, allowing combat where no enemy expected them. To Allied airmen in 1941 and early 1942, the Zero seemed nearly invincible. But across the sky came a different beast, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the stubby, rugged fighter of the United States Navy and Marine Corps. Outclassed in speed and maneuverability, the Wildcat was no beauty. It lacked the Zero's elegant lines or feather, light handling. What it had, however, was resilience. The Wildcat could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero into falling fragments. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, protective armor, and sturdy frame gave its pilots a margin of survival in desperate battles. And in the crucible of combat, the Wildcat's weaknesses would be turned into unexpected strengths by the ingenuity and discipline of its pilots. When the campaign for Guadalcanal began, the balance of air power tilted sharply. The Japanese had veterans of years of combat in China and the early months of conquest across the Pacific. They were masters of the Zero's capabilities, executing precision turns and ambushes with a confidence that unsettled their foes. Many of America's aviators, by contrast, were fresh to war, learning their craft in blood and fire as the campaign unfolded. But necessity is the mother of innovation, and on Guadalcanal, those who flew the Wildcat began to adapt. Foremost among these adaptations was the development of new tactics designed to negate the Zero's advantages. The most famous of these became known as the tack weave, a maneuver invented by Commander John Thack. Two Wildcats flying side by side would turn toward one another whenever a Zero latched onto a tail, forcing the enemy into the line of fire of the other Wildcat. This coordination, demanding trust and precision, proved deadly effective. It leveled the playing field, turning the Wildcat into more than just a stubborn survivor. It made it a predator. Every day, the pilots of the Cactus Air Force rose to meet the challenge. They scrambled from the pierced steel planking of Henderson Field, climbing into skies that often belonged first to the enemy. Japanese raids came in waves, heralded by the faint glint of sunlight off wings high above. Bombers, escorted by nimble Zeros, aimed to shatter the airstrip and crush the Marines' tenuous hold. Against them, Wildcats clawed into the air, their engines straining, their cockpits baking in the tropical sun, to intercept and defend the precious runway. The duels that followed were savage in their simplicity. A Wildcat dove upon a bomber formation, guns chattering, while Zeros streaked in to intercept. In twisting spirals they clashed, wings flashing, tracers stitching through the blue, engines screaming as pilots yanked their machines through maneuvers that tested both man and metal. Survival often depended on fractions of a second. Who rolled first, who spotted the sun glint of an enemy wingtip, who dared hold the trigger just a moment longer before breaking away. In these swirling dogfights, the strengths and weaknesses of both aircraft became starkly clear. The Zero, with its astonishing agility, often gained the initial advantage, sliding onto the tail of a Wildcat with ease. But when the Wildcat refused to fall, when its armor absorbed the punishment, and its pilot dove in a controlled plummet, the tables could turn. The Zero's Achilles heel was its fragility. A few well-placed rounds could ignite its fuel tanks or tear apart its frame, and unlike the Wildcat, the Zero lacked armor to shield its pilots from the merciless bite of enemy bullets. The psychological dimension of these encounters was immense. American pilots, many scarcely out of training, faced foes who had been raised in a martial culture that venerated the warrior spirit. For the Japanese aviators, defeat was unthinkable, death often preferable to failure. For the Americans, the stakes were equally high, not just survival, but the defense of the island, the defense of their brothers in arms fighting on the ground. The jungles below were littered with wreckage, smoldering reminders of those who had gambled and lost in the aerial lottery of life and death. Individual stories emerged that captured the grit of this air war. Marines who had never flown in combat before Guadalcanal quickly became aces, learning in days what peacetime training had failed to teach. Japanese veterans, though highly skilled, began to wear thin as attrition claimed the cream of their aviators. Every pilot lost was a treasure Japan could ill afford to replace, while the United States, though bloodied, sent more men, more machines, more replacements into the crucible. Slowly, imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. Still, for every victory there was tragedy. A Wildcat trailing smoke as it limped toward Henderson Field might crash short of the strip, the pilot lost in a fiery end. A Zero, crippled by machine gun fire, might plunge into the jungle canopy, its wreckage swallowed by green silence. In the skies above Guadalcanal, courage and sacrifice were constants, woven into the very fabric of the campaign. These duels were more than isolated skirmishes. They were the living pulse of the struggle for air supremacy. Each dogfight determined whether bombers reached their targets, whether supply convoys made landfall, whether Marines on the ground endured another day of bombardment or found a measure of relief. The contest of the Zero and the Wildcat was, in truth, a contest of endurance, a question of which nation could adapt, innovate, and endure the withering grind of attrition. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the once invincible aura of the Zero had begun to fade. Its supremacy challenged, its edge dulled. It no longer inspired the same fear it once commanded. The Wildcat, though never the faster or more agile machine, had proven its worth through toughness, teamwork, and the indomitable will of its pilots. The duels in the sky had shown that war was not won by machines alone, but by the men who flew, them, their ingenuity, their courage, and their refusal to yield when the odds seemed longest. And so, over the steaming jungles and restless seas of Guadalcanal, the clash of wings became an enduring symbol of the campaign, fragile men and fragile machines, defying gravity and mortality, each duel a battle within a battle, each encounter a story of sacrifice and survival written in the boundless sky. By the late summer of 1942, Guadalcanal had become more than just a patch of contested jungle. It had become a crucible in which the fate of the Pacific War was being decided. The Japanese High Command remained determined to reinforce and resupply their embattled troops on the island, convinced that, with enough persistence and sacrifice, they could wrest control of Henderson Field and drive the Americans into the sea. But what they had not foreseen was the grinding, merciless toll that attrition, waged in the skies above and on the sea lanes below, would take on their ability to fight. From the start, Japan's great weakness in the Guadalcanal campaign was logistics. The Imperial Navy, stretched across the Pacific, relied on the so-called Tokyo Express, the nightly destroyer runs that attempted to slip past American forces under cover of darkness. These sleek and swift warships could dart in and out of Ironbottom, sound, unloading men and supplies before withdrawing into the night. But the Tokyo Express could not carry heavy equipment, large quantities of ammunition, or the fuel desperately needed by Japanese forces on the island. And with daylight came a far deadlier problem, the dominance of the skies by the Cactus Air Force. Flying out of Henderson Field, American aviators, Marine Navy, and Army alike, became the bane of Japanese convoys. By day, their fighters roamed the skies, hunting down bombers and patrol planes. Their dive bombers and torpedo bombers swooped upon Japanese destroyers, transports, and barges that lingered too long or ventured too close. Every attempt by Tokyo to mount a large-scale resupply convoy was met with the same result: fiery wreckage drifting in Ironbottom Sound, transports left ablaze, and Japanese soldiers forced to swim desperately for the shores of Guadalcanal, often without weapons, food, or shelter. The Japanese soldiers who did reach land arrived half-starved, exhausted, and stripped of the supplies needed to sustain themselves. Rations grew so scarce that men resorted to eating roots, coconuts, and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Malnutrition and disease, especially malaria and dysentery, ravaged their ranks. Officers wrote in their diaries of men collapsing from hunger, their strength gone before they had even reached the front lines. One soldier recalled that on a forced march, men simply dropped along the trail, unable to rise again, their comrades too weak to help them. In stark contrast, the Americans, though battered and strained, were steadily receiving reinforcements and supplies. Their convoys were not without risk, but with Henderson Field's protection, more ships got through. The Japanese soon realized that without air superiority, their control of the seas was an illusion, and it was here that attrition worked its slow but devastating magic. Each Japanese attempt to send reinforcements came at staggering cost. Destroyers lost to bombs, transports sunk with thousands of men aboard, and pilots killed in desperate daylight missions meant to shield the convoys. The famed Japanese pilots of the early Pacific War, once the terror of the skies, were now being whittled away by the unrelenting pace of combat. Replacements, often rushed through training, lacked the skill and experience of their predecessors. The Zero, though still agile and deadly in the right hands, could not by itself alter the balance once the Americans had momentum, numbers, and Henderson Field. And as the months dragged on, the Japanese troops stranded on Guadalcanal began to feel the invisible weight of that air superiority. Every rumble of engines in the sky, every shriek of diving aircraft, signaled not just immediate danger, but the crushing reality that they were being isolated, starved, and slowly destroyed. Morale sank lower with each passing week. Reports filtered back to Tokyo of units reduced to skeleton forces, their fighting capacity crippled not by defeat in battle, but by hunger and despair. The Americans, too, suffered. Exhaustion, malaria, and the constant strain of combat gnawed at them. But unlike their enemies, they had food, medicine, and the steady reassurance that they were part of a growing tide of reinforcements. They were fighting a war of attrition, and in that kind of war, it was the side with supplies, factories, and secure logistics that would inevitably triumph. The impact of air superiority was not always dramatic, not always measured in a single decisive battle. Instead, it was a slow grinding down of the Japanese war effort, a tightening noose that strangled their ability to fight. By late 1942, the men on the ground knew it. The Japanese, who once struck with lightning speed and irresistible momentum, now seemed trapped in a war that bled them white, their courage and discipline unable to overcome the steady erosion of their strength. Guadalcanal was no longer just a contest of arms, it was a test of endurance, and air superiority had tilted the balance. From the skies above Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force became more than a tactical asset. It became the symbol of America's growing dominance in the Pacific, and the harbinger of Japan's slow, inexorable decline. The victory of seizing Henderson Field had been a triumph, but for the Marines who held that strip of land, life on Guadalcanal was nothing short of relentless misery. The fighting may have dominated headlines back home, but the day-to-day existence of those men was consumed not just by the Japanese, but by the island itself. Nature, disease, and deprivation became enemies as formidable as any soldier carrying a rifle. The island of Guadalcanal was beautiful from a distance, its lush green hills rolling into deep valleys and white beaches meeting the shimmering Pacific. But beauty quickly gave way to hostility. The dense jungle pressed in from every side, alive with insects that tormented day and night. The equatorial sun baked the land into a steaming oven, while sudden downpours turned everything into a quagmire of mud. Marines slogged through it ankle deep, their boots rotting away as much as their morale. The rains filled foxholes overnight, forcing exhausted men to bail water with their helmets, or else lie shivering in muddy pools, their rifles held above the rising flood. Food became another merciless adversary. The U.S. Navy's tenuous hold on supply lines meant that rations were meager, often late, and never enough. Marines quickly learned to survive on whatever they could scavenge. Standard meals often dwindled to a few spoonfuls of rice, canned hash, or spoiled meat. At times, men boiled rice until it stretched into thin, watery porridge, trying desperately to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Fruits were rare, fresh vegetables nearly non-existent, and vitamin deficiencies began to gnaw away at their bodies. Some joked grimly that they were wasting away faster than the enemy's bullets could find them, but the cruelest companion of all was malaria. Mosquitoes infested the swamps and rivers, carrying the parasite that ravaged the Marines in endless cycles of fever, chills, and weakness. Whole units were struck down, their fighting strength halved not by combat but by sickness. Men burned with fever one day, shook uncontrollably the next, then dragged themselves back into the line only to collapse again days later. Quinine and atabrine, the anti-malarial drugs of the time, were in short supply and often had harsh side effects. Marines joked darkly about the yellow pills they were forced to swallow, though there was nothing funny about the sallow complexions and gaunt faces that malaria left in its wake. By some estimates, more Marines were incapacitated by disease on Guadalcanal than by the Japanese. Sleep offered no escape. The jungle was alive at night with the whine of mosquitoes, the croaking of frogs, and the ever-present fear of Japanese infiltration. Snipers and small raiding parties would slip through the darkness, sending bursts of gunfire into American positions or tossing grenades before vanishing back into the trees. Every rustle in the brush might have been an enemy creeping closer and nerves frayed under the constant strain. Men slept lightly, rifles cradled in their arms, and woke at the slightest snap of a twig. Isolation compounded the misery. Months passed before some Marines received letters from home, and even when mail arrived, it carried a reminder of the normal lives they had left behind, lives that felt impossibly distant. The environment punished in countless ways. Jungle rot, a fungal infection that devoured skin left constantly damp, left men's feet raw and ulcerated. Leeches clung silently to legs and arms, only noticed when they had gorged themselves. Flies swarmed every meal, every wound, and every latrine. The stench of unwashed uniforms, rotting vegetation, and death, human and animal alike, hung over the camps like a curse. In these conditions, even the simplest act of existence became a struggle. And yet, amid this crucible, the Marines forged bonds stronger than steel. In the mud, sickness, and hunger, they clung to each other for strength. Shared hardship became its own form of defiance. A can of peaches split among a squad was cause for celebration. A joke shared in a foxhole, even through chattering teeth, could lift spirits. Letters from home, read aloud by lantern light, became communal treasures. The Marines endured, because to falter meant handing the island and Henderson Field back to the enemy. The Japanese had expected the American invaders to wither away, broken by the environment and starved into submission. And at times, it seemed they might. But what the Japanese underestimated was the sheer grit of those Marines. Each day survived was another victory. Each night endured another blow struck against the enemy's hopes. Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield. It was a test of human endurance where men discovered just how much suffering they could bear and still rise to fight again at dawn. The moon hung low over Guadalcanal in September 1942, casting an eerie silvery glow over the dense jungle canopy and the open ridgeline that would soon become one of the most hallowed grounds in Marine Corps history. Known simply as Edson's Ridge, the high ground south of Henderson Field was little more than a series of grassy slopes and low knolls, interspersed with patches of scrub brush and trees. Yet its value was immeasurable. Whoever controlled the ridge controlled the approach to Henderson Field, the heart of American resistance on the island. The Japanese recognized this with clarity, and they were determined to seize it, no matter the cost. The man entrusted with defending the ridge was Colonel Merritt, a Red, Mike Edson, commander of the One Stone Marine Raider Battalion, a seasoned leader with a calm demeanor and a piercing tactical mind. Edson understood both the importance of the ground and the desperate state of his men. His raiders, joined by elements of the One Stone Parachute Battalion, were exhausted. Many were weakened by malaria, dysentery, and hunger, their uniforms soaked in the constant Guadalcanal rains. Yet Edson inspired them with quiet determination. He walked the line, speaking to groups of Marines in hushed tones, telling them simply, "They'll come. Hold this ground. Hold it until the last man." His men believed him, even as fear gnawed at their insides. On the night of September 12th, the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. From the dark tree line beyond the ridge, the first sounds of movement began to emerge. Branches snapped, whispers carried through the humid air, and then the sharp cracks of rifles erupted as Japanese infantry surged forward. These were elite troops of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's brigade, seasoned fighters who had been ordered to storm Henderson Field and crush the American presence once and for all. Nearly 3,000 strong, they advanced under the cover of darkness, their bayonets glinting faintly in the moonlight. as they pressed toward the thin Marine line. The first assaults slammed into the forward outposts, catching Marines in sudden flares of gunfire. Automatic weapons roared to life, tracer rounds stitching across the slopes, illuminating the night in terrifying bursts of light. The raiders and paratroopers fought grimly, pouring fire into the advancing waves, but the Japanese were relentless. They came screaming Banzai as they charged, using the cover of the tall grass and the contours of the ridge to close the distance. At times, combat collapsed into brutal hand-to-hand fighting, Marines and Japanese soldiers, grappling in the mud, knives, rifle butts, and bare hands deciding who lived and who died. By midnight, the Japanese had penetrated deep into Edson's lines. Small groups of Marines were cut off, forced into desperate last stands on hillocks and knolls. Edson himself moved calmly among his men, directing reinforcements, shifting machine gun teams, and personally rallying broken groups to rejoin the fight. He called for artillery support, and soon American howitzers on Henderson Field thundered into action, lobbing shells that crashed into the jungle and tore gaps in the attacking ranks. Still, the Japanese pressed on, their courage matched only by their ferocity. At dawn on September 13th, the battle intensified into a storm of violence. As pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, Edson's Marines were driven back onto the very crest of the ridge. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and the ground itself was slick with blood and rain. But the Marines refused to yield. From hastily dug foxholes and behind makeshift barricades of logs and bodies, they fought with grim resolve. Browning machine guns clattered, mortars thumped, and rifle fire cracked ceaselessly. Every man knew that if the ridge fell, Henderson Field and the entire American foothold on Guadalcanal would be lost. In one of the most desperate hours of the battle, Edson himself took position at the front, rallying his raiders with a steady voice that cut through the chaos. "There is no falling back from here, boys," he declared. "We hold." His men, inspired by his presence, dug in harder, firing until their gun barrels smoked and their shoulders ached from recoil. The Japanese, for all their bravery, began to falter under the withering American fire and the pounding artillery from Henderson Field. By midday, the survivors withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind a carpet of bodies. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay sprawled across the ridge, testament to their determination and to the unbreakable resolve of the Marines who had held their ground. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield was a scene of devastation. The Marines had suffered heavy losses, hundreds killed or wounded, but they had held Edson's Ridge. The Japanese assault had been broken, and Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands. For their valor, Edson's raiders and paratroopers would forever be remembered as the men who stood on a knife's edge and refused to break. Colonel Edson himself would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership that night, though he always insisted it was his men who deserved the glory. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later known simply as Bloody Ridge, was more than just a tactical victory. It was a defining moment in the Guadalcanal campaign, a symbol of Marine grit and tenacity under the most desperate circumstances. On that ridge, the line between survival and annihilation was razor thin, and it was held not by overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but by the unshakable determination of men who understood that if they yielded even an inch, the entire war in the Pacific might tilt in the enemy's favor. By the time the calendar turned to October 1942, Guadalcanal had already become a crucible of attrition. For nearly 2 months, American and Japanese forces had battered one another on land, at sea, and in the air. Yet neither side had achieved decisive control. For Tokyo's high command, the growing urgency was unmistakable. The Imperial Army could not allow a handful of Marines and soldiers to maintain their grip on Henderson Field. Its very existence posed a dagger aimed at Japan's southern lifeline, threatening troop movements, supply runs, and the Empire's defensive perimeter in the Solomons. Thus was born the most ambitious attempt yet to retake the island, the October Offensive. The Japanese plan was massive in scope, meant to crush the Americans through weight of numbers and relentless assault. Reinforcements poured into Rabaul and onward into the Solomons, funneled by the Tokyo Express destroyer runs. By mid-October, General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army had been bolstered with fresh divisions, bringing thousands of battle-hardened soldiers to the front. They were joined by heavy artillery and even tanks, a rarity in the jungle campaigns. The goal was simple but uncompromising: smash the Marine perimeter, overwhelm Henderson Field, and annihilate the American foothold before it could expand. The prelude came with violence from the sea. On the night of October 13th, Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, slipped down the slot under cover of darkness. Their guns opened up with thunderous force, pouring nearly 1,000 14-inch shells into Henderson Field in a matter of minutes. The earth shook as the bombardment cratered runways, shredded aircraft, and left smoking wreckage across the airstrip. For the weary aviators of the Cactus Air Force, it was one of their darkest hours. Their planes burned on the tarmac, fuel stores erupted in flames, and sleep-deprived Marines clawed at the ground for cover. The Japanese were confident this barrage had crippled the Americans' ability to resist. But the American defenders, though battered, were not broken. At dawn, ground crews scrambled to repair runways with hand tools, filling craters with whatever they could muster. Surviving aircraft were patched, refueled, and pushed back into service, their pilots grimly determined to keep the skies contested. Even amid wreckage and smoke, Henderson remained alive, a testament to improvisation and grit. Meanwhile, the Japanese army began its march. Thousands of soldiers, burdened with rifles, mortars, and the unyielding discipline of their officers, hacked their way through the island's brutal jungle interior. The terrain was merciless. Steep ridges, swollen rivers, and choking humidity sapped their strength long before they reached the American perimeter. Yet they pressed forward, spurred on by the promise of victory and the Emperor's expectations. The first major thrust came on October 23rd, when elements of the Japanese 2nd Division attempted to storm across the Matanikau River. They hurled themselves into the teeth of Marine defenses, where dug-in riflemen, machine gunners, and artillery spotters waited. The clash erupted into a storm of fire. Mortar shells rained on advancing columns, machine guns cut through charging soldiers, and the riverbanks became choked with bodies. Despite their bravery, the Japanese assault was thrown back with punishing losses. But the heart of the offensive came 2 nights later. On October 24th, under the cover of darkness and the relentless sound of insects in the jungle, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's forces launched their full-scale assault. Nearly 7,000 men surged toward the southern edge of the Marine perimeter, seeking to break through the ridges and seize Henderson Field. The terrain favored the defenders. Dense undergrowth and swampy clearings funneled the Japanese into narrow killing grounds, but the attackers pressed forward with unyielding ferocity. For the Marines of the 1 Stone Division, this was the test of their endurance. Units like those under Colonel Chesty Puller and others manned machine gun nests, coordinated artillery, and held their lines with grim determination. The night became a scene of chaos and horror. Bugles blared in the darkness as waves of Japanese soldiers charged, bayonets fixed and voices shouting in unison. American guns blazed in reply, tracers arcing across the blackness, explosions lighting the jungle in stuttering bursts. The ground itself seemed alive with death, as men fell screaming into the mud. Despite suffering devastating casualties, the Japanese hurled themselves forward again and again. By dawn, the ground south of Henderson Field was littered with the dead and dying. Thousands of Japanese soldiers cut down in their attempt to breach the perimeter. Marines, exhausted, filthy, and shaking from lack of sleep, had held the line, but at terrible cost to both sides. The following days saw counterattacks by American forces, determined not only to secure their positions but to drive the enemy back from striking distance of Henderson. On October 26th, the U.S. Navy clashed with Japanese carriers in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, another desperate bid to control the seas around Guadalcanal. While the Americans lost the carrier Hornet, the Japanese again paid dearly in irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. By the end of the October offensive, it was clear that Japan's gamble had failed. Thousands of its finest soldiers lay dead in the jungle. The survivors, gaunt and disease-ridden, stumbled back into the wilderness, their morale shaken, their divisions gutted. The Americans, though strained to the breaking point, had endured. Henderson Field remained in their hands. The October battles marked a grim turning point. Japan had committed immense manpower and resources to break the American hold on Guadalcanal, and failed. The attrition was shifting against them, and the momentum of the campaign was beginning to slip. For the Marines and soldiers still clinging to the mud and misery of their foxholes, there was no sense of triumph, only the knowledge that the struggle was far from over. Yet, in the jungle silence after the guns went quiet, one truth rang clear: Guadalcanal would not fall easily. The Matanacao River, a seemingly unremarkable ribbon of water winding through Guadalcanal's dense jungles, emptying into the sea just a few miles west of Henderson Field. But for the men who fought there, its muddy banks became a recurring stage for violence, ambush, and endurance. It was here, along the ridges and tangled thickets near this river, that a series of brutal clashes unfolded, skirmishes that would shape the tempo of the Guadalcanal campaign and mark the beginning of a shift in American confidence. For the Japanese, the Matanacao offered more than just terrain. It was a strategic lifeline. West of Henderson Field, the river's crossing points gave access routes for assembling forces, staging artillery, and launching thrusts against the American perimeter. For the Marines, holding the Matanacao line meant securing the airfield's western flank, preventing enemy concentrations that could strike at the heart of their lifeline. The first clashes came in late September 1942, when the Marines attempted a probing advance across the river. But the Japanese battle-hardened veterans of earlier campaigns lay in ambush. As Marine patrols crossed the shallows, they were cut down by machine gun bursts and mortars. The jungle erupted with gunfire, echoing through the valley. Bloodied but unbroken, the Marines withdrew, learning that the Japanese were prepared to fight ferociously for every inch of ground. Days later, reinforcements arrived. This time, Colonel Merritt "Red" Mike Edson, the hero of Bloody Ridge, directed operations. His Marines, hardened by weeks of fighting, moved westward once more. They crossed with caution, artillery and mortars providing covering fire, while naval gunfire from offshore pummeled suspected Japanese positions. Smoke and earth rose into the humid air, shaking the jungle canopy. Yet again, Japanese soldiers emerged from concealed bunkers, their discipline unwavering, their firepower sharp. What was meant to be a quick push devolved into hours of chaotic fighting in dense vegetation. Men charging through thickets, bayonets fixed, grenades exploding in the undergrowth. By early October, the Matanacao had become a killing ground for both sides. Each clash carried the same pattern: probing advances, brutal ambushes, and sudden counterattacks. Marines found themselves crouching low in muddy foxholes, swatting away mosquitoes while Japanese snipers hunted them from the trees. At night, flares lit the jungle in eerie bursts of light as both sides launched raids under cover of darkness. But unlike earlier engagements, the Americans were beginning to adjust. They brought heavier artillery, called in precise naval bombardments, and coordinated air support from the Cactus Air Force overhead. When Japanese troops tried to mass west of the river, dive bombers and strafing runs scattered them in deadly waves of fire. For the first time, Japanese soldiers realized that American control of the skies was tipping the balance. The most decisive moment came in mid-October. In a carefully coordinated operation, Marine battalions crossed the Matanacao with the backing of tanks, artillery, and naval fire. This time, the assault did not falter. Columns of Marines pushed across the river, rolling back Japanese positions with relentless firepower. Caught between the American advance and withering bombardments from the sea, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were killed, their units shattered. The river, once their staging ground, had become their graveyard. For the Marines, the victory was more than tactical. It was psychological. After weeks of stalemate and desperate defense, the clashes at the Matanacao gave them proof that they could not only hold their ground, but push the Japanese back. The sense of being on the defensive, of waiting for the next assault, began to fade. Confidence was taking root. Still, the fighting left scars. The stench of death clung to the jungle, and the river ran red with blood after each clash. Marines spoke in hushed tones about comrades who had fallen, buried, hastily in shallow graves along the riverbank. For the Japanese survivors, the battles were equally haunting, proof that American resistance was not crumbling as Tokyo had promised, but strengthening with each passing week. The Matanikau, once a nameless river in the Solomon Islands, had become a landmark etched into the memory of both sides. It was not a single battle, but a series of trials, moments where small units of men tested each other's will, endurance, and belief in victory. And by the time the smoke cleared, the Marines knew that Guadalcanal was no longer just about survival. It was about pushing forward, seizing the initiative, and turning the tide of a campaign that had begun so precariously. The river had been crossed, not just in geography, but in spirit. By October of 1942, Guadalcanal had become a grinding stalemate of men, machines, and willpower. The Japanese clung stubbornly to their belief that Henderson Field could be retaken, while the Americans understood with growing clarity that the airfield was the key to the Solomon Islands campaign. Yet each attempt by Tokyo to deliver reinforcements across the waters of the slot meant fresh clashes at sea, and as darkness fell across the South Pacific, the stage was set for one of the most important early naval engagements of the campaign, the Battle of Cape Esperance. The Japanese had dispatched a force of cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto with a clear mission: shell Henderson Field into silence and escort yet another wave of troop transports down the Tokyo Express. For weeks, Japanese ships had moved largely unchallenged at night, their crews masters of gunnery and torpedo tactics in the blackness of the Pacific. They believed that once again they would sweep down Ironbottom Sound, under cover of night wreak havoc, and withdraw unseen before dawn. But this time, the Americans were waiting. Rear Admiral Norman Scott had gathered a force of heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. His men were green, still shaken by the disaster at Savo Island 2 months before, where Japanese cruisers had annihilated an Allied screening force in the dead of night. Yet they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Scott drilled his crews relentlessly in night maneuvers, practicing radar, directed gunnery, and carefully plotting how to ambush Japanese squadrons. On the evening of October 11th, as the moonlight glittered off the restless waters near Cape Esperance, Scott's task force sailed into position. The Americans carried a new and still largely untested advantage: radar. For the first time in the Solomons campaign, U.S. cruisers would enter a night battle guided not just by lookouts straining their eyes against the dark, but by electronic pulses sweeping across the horizon. Shortly before midnight, radar screens flickered with the telltale signals of Japanese ships approaching. The Americans held their fire, maneuvering silently into an ambush position, their engines churning low and steady. Then, at a range where the Japanese never expected contact, the night erupted. The heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, along with her companions Salt Lake City, Boise, and Helena, opened fire in a storm of shells. Muzzles flashed, tracers arced across the Black Sea, and towering plumes of water erupted around Goto's flagship Aoba. The admiral himself was mortally wounded in the opening barrage, leaving his command in chaos. Japanese gunners, taken by surprise, scrambled to respond, yet the battle was far from one-sided. Amid the confusion of smoke, searchlights, and crisscrossing gunfire, several American ships became silhouetted against the moonlit background, perfect targets for Japanese return salvos. The light cruiser Boise, in particular, was struck repeatedly, her hull punctured and fires raging below deck. Only the discipline of her crew and quick damage control saved her from destruction. Destroyers on both sides joined the fray in desperate torpedo runs, darting through the gunfire like wolves in the night. When the firing finally subsided in the early hours of October 12th, the waters near Cape Esperance bore the scars of savage combat. 2 Japanese cruisers and a destroyer had been sunk or heavily damaged, while the Americans had lost a single destroyer and suffered serious damage to the Boise. Strategically, the Japanese still managed to land troops further up the coast, but tactically, the balance had shifted. For the first time in the campaign, the United States Navy had stood toe-to-toe with the vaunted Imperial Japanese Navy in a night surface action and emerged the victor. The news reverberated across Guadalcanal. For Marines clinging to their foxholes around Henderson Field, weary from constant bombardment and short on supplies, the knowledge that their Navy could protect them at night brought a surge of morale. For sailors who had endured the humiliation of Savo Island, Cape Esperance was a redemption, a proof that training, radar, and raw determination could overcome Japanese skill and daring. Yet the battle also carried sobering lessons. The chaos of nighttime identification had nearly led to American ships firing on one another. Radar was powerful, but not infallible. And though the victory was real, Japanese reinforcements still reached the island, prolonging the campaign's bloody grind. But symbolism mattered as much as strategy. In the long, dark struggle for Guadalcanal, Cape Esperance marked a turning point in confidence. The Americans had tasted victory in a night battle, a realm long dominated by Japan, and that taste would fuel their resolve in the even greater. Sea clashes still to come. By the autumn of 1942, the seas around Guadalcanal had become the deadliest waters on Earth. Both navies understood that control of the skies over the island depended not only on Henderson field but on the fragile carriers that brought striking power into the theater. Though scarred by losses at Coral Sea and Midway, the aircraft carrier remained the decisive weapon. And now, in October, the Americans and the Japanese prepared to clash. Again, this time in the waters north of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese plan was bold. After repeated setbacks in their attempts to dislodge the Marines from Guadalcanal, Imperial Headquarters resolved to commit its full naval strength to one last decisive effort. The mighty battleships Hiei and Kirishima, heavy cruisers, and the cream of the carrier fleet, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the light carrier, Zuiho, were assembled under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who had once struck Pearl Harbor. Their mission: annihilate the American fleet, destroy Henderson Field, and deliver Guadalcanal into Japanese hands. Facing them was a smaller and battered U.S. task force, led by Admiral Thomas Kincaid. His carriers were Enterprise, still bearing the scars of earlier battles, and Hornet, the last undamaged fleet carrier in the Pacific since Wasp had been sunk in September. Their escorting cruisers and destroyers were seasoned but outnumbered. The American fleet's margin was slim, yet its resolve was iron. To lose here would mean abandoning Guadalcanal. On the morning of October 26, 1942, the two carrier forces launched almost simultaneously. Dozens of aircraft clawed their way into the sky, heavy with bombs and torpedoes. The vast Pacific horizon filled with the glint of wings, each squadron searching for the other's position. The stage was set for another carrier duel, an invisible chess match of scouts, signals, and swift steel. The Japanese struck first. From Shokaku and Zuikaku, waves of Zero fighters and torpedo bombers plunged toward Hornet. The Americans threw everything into the air to stop them. Wildcat fighters clawed desperately at the attackers, their guns rattling. But the sheer weight of the Japanese assault was overwhelming. Bombs rained down, smashing Hornet's flight deck, tearing open hangars, and igniting planes loaded with fuel. Torpedoes ripped through her hull, sending shockwaves deep into the ship's steel bones. Within minutes, Hornet was a burning, crippled hulk. Yet even as Hornet staggered under fire, her own squadrons struck back. American dive bombers roared out of the sun and hammered Shokaku, blasting her flight deck into ruin and setting fires that forced her out of the battle. Another wave tore into the light carrier Zuiho, leaving her deck pitted and useless. Though Zuikaku remained intact, Japan's offensive punch was blunted. But the duel was far from over. Enterprise, targeted by successive Japanese waves, fought for survival. Bombs exploded across her decks, showering the sea with steel fragments and smoke. At one point, only her damage control crews, working with remarkable discipline and courage, kept her afloat and in action. In the skies above, American and Japanese pilots wove a deadly tapestry of contrails and fire, men on both sides fighting to the death in an unforgiving ballet of machines. As the day wore on, the balance tilted. Though the Japanese had suffered serious damage to Shokaku and Zuiho, their remaining carrier, Zuikaku, could still operate effectively, and their veteran aircrews pressed their advantage. American losses in aircraft mounted. Pilots who survived their missions often found nowhere to land. Hornet was mortally wounded, and Enterprise barely clung to operational status. By late afternoon, the grim decision was made. Hornet, her fires uncontrollable and her machinery dead, had to be abandoned. Crewmen leapt into the sea as Japanese aircraft continued to circle, while destroyers closed in to take survivors aboard. Repeated efforts to scuttle her failed, and only after torpedoes from American destroyers and, later, Japanese forces finished the work did the carrier finally slide beneath the waves. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was over. On the surface, it seemed a Japanese victory. The United States had lost Hornet, and Enterprise was left in no shape to contest the seas. American aircraft losses were heavy, and their carrier force in the South Pacific had been reduced to a single battered ship. Yet beneath the surface, the deeper story favored the Americans. Japan could claim a tactical triumph, but it was a triumph that came at a cost she could not afford. Hundreds of her most experienced pilots, men trained since before the war, had been killed or lost. Aircraft were destroyed in numbers the Japanese industrial machine could not replace. While Shokaku and Zuiho limped home for months of repair, the United States, with its vast industrial might, would soon replace Hornet with newer carriers already sliding down the ways of American shipyards. The battle marked a turning point of a different kind. For the first time, Japan had won the fight on the sea yet lost the war in the air. The attrition of irreplaceable aviators, more than the loss of steel, would sap the strength of the Imperial Navy. By the end of 1942, the air groups that had once terrorized the Pacific skies were a shadow of their former selves. Santa Cruz had been a brutal, costly fight, and for the men who survived, the memories were seared into their souls. But history would show that beneath the smoke of burning ships, the sacrifice of Hornet and her crew was not in vain. The Japanese advance had been slowed again. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the slow grinding wheel of attrition continued to turn relentlessly in favor of the United States. The waters around Guadalcanal by November of 1942 had become a graveyard of ships. Hulks of destroyers and cruisers lay twisted on the seabed, the currents sweeping silently over their rusting steel. Men called it Ironbottom Sound, for every clash here seemed to end with shattered vessels slipping beneath the waves. Now, after months of bitter stalemate, the Japanese prepared a bold gamble. Their aim was nothing less than the destruction of Henderson Field itself, the stubborn airstrip that had bled their supply convoys dry. To do this, they sent forward some of their finest battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, escorted by cruisers and destroyers to shell the airfield into rubble. On the night of November 12th, the first clash began. A hastily assembled American force under Admiral Daniel Callahan steamed into the darkness. His ships were mismatched and poorly coordinated, yet they interposed themselves between the Japanese bombardment group and Henderson Field. What followed was a close-quarters brawl of almost medieval ferocity. In the pitch black, amid torrential rain squalls, opposing ships collided at point-blank range. Gun flashes lit the night like lightning. Searchlights stabbed through the mist, only to draw torrents of enemy fire. The American flagship San Francisco fought desperately, dueling against the battleship Hiei, at such close range that shells sometimes overshot and crashed into the jungle ashore. Callahan himself was killed on the bridge, his body torn apart by shrapnel, yet his ships continued the fight. Destroyers sacrificed themselves with torpedoes and ramming attacks, buying precious minutes. When dawn broke, Hiei was left burning, riddled with shell holes and struggling to escape. American planes from Henderson Field swarmed in to finish her, hammering her with bomb after bomb until she rolled over and sank. The cost, however, was staggering. The U.S. Navy had lost 2 admirals, Callahan and Norman Scott, along with several cruisers and destroyers. The ocean boiled with oil, fire, and the cries of men clinging to rafts, but Henderson Field still stood. The Japanese bombardment had been delayed, and that delay would prove decisive. Barely 2 nights later, the second act of this drama unfolded. Another Japanese force, this time with Kirishima in the lead, pushed toward Guadalcanal. Awaiting them was a smaller but more disciplined American task group, commanded by Admiral Willis Lee aboard the battleship Washington. Lee, a calm and calculating officer, was an expert in gunnery and one of the few admirals who truly grasped the power of radar. His ships slipped silently through the night, radar guiding their eyes where human vision failed. As Kirishima closed in, Washington opened fire. Her great 16-inch guns roared in salvos, each thunderous broadside hurling a ton of steel toward the Japanese battleship. Shells tore into Kirishima's superstructure, smashing turrets, igniting fires, and ripping holes through her armor. Unlike the chaotic melee of 2 nights before, this was controlled, disciplined destruction. Washington remained undamaged, maneuvering steadily as she poured round after round into her crippled opponent. Kirishima staggered, her crew fighting desperately to save her, but she was doomed. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship, and before dawn she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. For the Americans, this battle was more than a tactical victory. It was a turning point. At last, a U.S. battleship had entered the waters of Ironbottom Sound and emerged triumphant. The aura of Japanese naval superiority, so dominant since Pearl Harbor, had been broken. For the Japanese, the loss of 2 battleships and countless destroyers and cruisers in these November clashes was a blow from which they would never fully recover. As the smoke cleared, it became clear that the fate of Guadalcanal had shifted. The Japanese could no longer protect their convoys, nor could they silence Henderson Field. The brutal surface battles of November had drained their strength and sealed the island's destiny. The waters off Guadalcanal, once a pathway for Japanese reinforcements, had become a place of ruin. And though the sea would claim many more ships before the campaign was finished, the U.S. Navy had shown that it could meet the Imperial fleet in night battle, match its ferocity, and prevail. The road ahead was still bloody, but the tide had begun to turn. By late November 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal had already earned a reputation as the most dangerous seas in the Pacific. The brutal November battles had shattered both fleets, leaving the Americans bloodied but holding Henderson Field, and the Japanese battered yet unyielding in their efforts to sustain their troops on the island. It was into this exhausted, deadly theater that another clash erupted, one that would showcase Japanese ingenuity, American overconfidence, and the terrifying lethality of the long lance torpedo. This would be remembered as the naval battle of Tassafaronga. The context was desperation. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were starving, their rice ration reduced to mere handfuls a day, their health broken by malaria and hunger. Tokyo was determined to resupply them, even as American control of Henderson Field made daytime runs suicidal. Their solution remained the night convoys of the Tokyo Express, swift destroyers, darting down the slot, laden with food and ammunition packed into metal drums. But these supply missions had grown increasingly perilous. American radar, coupled with aggressive patrols, threatened to strangle the Japanese lifeline. On the night of November 30, 1942, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka led a force of 8 destroyers toward Guadalcanal, each carrying supply drums lashed to their decks. Tanaka's orders were not to seek battle. His mission was delivery. But awaiting him near Tassafaronga Point was a powerful American force under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright, 5 heavy cruisers, 4 destroyers, and a new determination to crush the Tokyo Express once and for all. Armed with superior firepower and radar, the Americans believed they had the advantage. What they did not fully appreciate was the weapon the Japanese brought with them, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the most advanced and deadly torpedo of the war. As the night unfolded, American destroyers made radar contact first. Wright ordered an opening torpedo salvo, followed by the heavy cruisers unleashing their batteries. Gunfire erupted across the Black Seas, shells screaming into the night. One Japanese destroyer, Takanami, was immediately caught in the storm of fire, pummeled into a burning wreck. To the Americans, it appeared a decisive ambush. They pressed forward, confident the night belonged to them. But Tanaka's destroyers had already loosed their long lances. Sleek, oxygen-fueled, and carrying massive warheads, these torpedoes could travel nearly 20 miles. At high speed, double the range of their American counterparts, and they left almost no visible wake. To the American crews, they were invisible killers sliding through the black water. Within minutes, the ocean around Tassafaronga erupted in flashes and thunder. The heavy cruiser USS Minneapolis shuddered violently as a torpedo slammed into her bow, ripping it apart in a geyser of flame and steel. Barely had the echoes faded when another long lance tore into the USS New Orleans, shearing away her entire bow forward of turret number 2. The shattered wreckage floated grotesquely, the forward guns now lying in the sea, still attached by twisted metal as the cruiser limped out of line. The carnage did not stop. USS Pensacola, maneuvering to avoid her crippled sisters, exposed her broadside, only to be struck amidships by another torpedo that touched off a roaring fire. Moments later, USS Northampton, at the rear of the American column, was struck by 2 torpedoes in quick succession. Flames engulfed her, and despite desperate efforts, she sank in the early hours of the morning. In less than 20 minutes, the Americans had gone from confident hunters to a force mauled beyond recognition. Admiral Tanaka, remarkably, had lost only the single destroyer, Takanami. His supply mission had failed, the drums were not delivered, but his force had delivered a crushing blow. For the Japanese, it was a bittersweet outcome, tactical triumph, strategic failure. Their soldiers on Guadalcanal would continue to starve, yet the legend of the long lance torpedo was sealed that night. For the Americans, Tassafaronga was a sobering reminder. Radar and numbers could not replace training, doctrine, and respect for the enemy's capabilities. The loss of 1 cruiser and the crippling of 3 others in exchange for a single Japanese destroyer was a stinging humiliation. Yet despite the disaster, the Americans retained the larger truth. They still held Guadalcanal, and Japan's supply problem remained unsolved. The Battle of Tassafaronga thus became another chapter in the war of attrition, a clash where one side demonstrated technological brilliance, while the other absorbed the punishment and pressed forward. In the larger campaign, the Japanese had no reserves to replace their losses, while America's industrial might was only beginning to gather pace. The long lances had spoken with devastating power, but the tide of the Pacific War was already turning. By December of 1942, the struggle for Guadalcanal had dragged on for 4 long, punishing months. What had begun in August with daring amphibious landings and violent clashes at sea had now devolved into a grinding stalemate, where exhaustion, hunger, and disease weighed as heavily on the combatants as bullets and shells. The tropical paradise, once dense with palms and alive with the hum of cicadas, had transformed into a fetid battlefield of mud, decay, and human suffering. Both armies, Japanese and American, found themselves trapped in a struggle, not only against each other, but against the merciless island itself. For the Marines and soldiers of the United States, Henderson Field remained the fragile prize, a lifeline defended with grit and desperation. Yet holding it had come at a tremendous cost. Supply lines, though somewhat more reliable than those of the enemy, were still tenuous and irregular. Rations arrived in fits and starts, and often the men went to sleep with their stomachs gnawing in hunger. Malaria, that invisible predator lurking in every mosquito, spread relentlessly through the ranks. By December, more than half the men on Guadalcanal had been struck by it, at least once, leaving them feverish, weak, and unable to fight. Dysentery and skin infections compounded the misery, turning daily existence into a grim battle for survival. The Japanese endured even worse. Their lifeline, the so-called Tokyo Express of destroyers running supplies down, the slot, could bring only a fraction of what was needed to sustain an army. Rice, already in short supply, had to be rationed to pitiful handfuls per man, barely enough to stave off starvation. Soldiers scavenged coconuts, roots, and whatever they could forage in the jungle. Many wasted away to skeletons draped in ragged uniforms, too weak to carry rifles or dig defenses. Malaria cut through their ranks as mercilessly as any American bullet, and tropical ulcers rotted flesh from bone. Yet Japanese commanders, still clinging to hope of retaking the airfield, demanded sacrifices from men already pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The air above Guadalcanal fell quieter than it had been in months. The great carrier clashes had shifted the balance of power, but in December, neither side could mount sustained operations. The Cactus Air Force still flew from Henderson Field, but reduced numbers of aircraft and exhausted crews limited their reach. Japanese pilots, equally worn, flew sporadic raids from Rabaul, but fuel and aircraft shortages gnawed at their capacity. When planes did meet over the steaming jungle or in the skies above Ironbottom Sound, the dogfights carried less of the furious energy of earlier months and more the grinding fatigue of opponents locked in a war of attrition. At sea, the night battles that had once thundered through the waters off Savo and Tassafaronga became less frequent. Both navies had paid a terrible price, and December's calm seas carried a foreboding silence, broken only by the occasional clash of patrols or the eerie rumble of distant shellfire. The wrecks littering Ironbottom Sound, American cruisers, Japanese destroyers, and transports stood as grim monuments to the ferocity of the struggle, their twisted steel hulls resting beneath the waves like a sunken cemetery. For the Marines in their foxholes, the war settled into an exhausting routine. Nights were spent listening for the telltale snap of twigs or whispered Japanese voices in the jungle, the fear of infiltration ever present. Days were filled with hacking through mud, tending to the sick, repairing bunkers, or simply enduring the suffocating heat. Mail from home was rare, and each letter, when it did arrive, was read and reread until the paper softened from handling. The men joked, sang, and cursed to keep spirits alive, but the strain of months without rest etched itself into their faces. For the Japanese, December was a nightmare of hunger and despair. Starving soldiers, driven to desperation, attempted to sneak through American lines at night to steal food or scavenge scraps. Some collapsed and died in the jungle before reaching the front. Others were captured, their bodies little more than bones beneath tattered cloth. Commanders still spoke of honor and victory, but to the average infantryman, the war on Guadalcanal had become a slow death march. As the month wore on, the stalemate grew unbearable. Both sides recognized that the island could not sustain such prolonged torment, yet neither was willing to yield. To the Japanese, Guadalcanal remained a matter of national honor, the airfield a dagger pointed at their defensive perimeter. To the Americans, giving up the island would mean abandoning months of sacrifice and allowing Japan to regain the initiative in the Pacific. And so the men endured, month after month, in mud-filled foxholes under a canopy of disease-ridden air. The stalemate of December was not one of peace, but of attrition, where the jungle itself seemed to choose the victor, slowly wearing down the weaker of the two. The stage was set for a final reckoning, as both armies, battered but unyielding, prepared for the decisive months ahead. By the end of 1942, the once vaunted Japanese war machine found itself bleeding, stretched, and reeling under the relentless strain of the Guadalcanal campaign. The battle, initially embraced with confidence and a sense of inevitability, had instead become a slow-motion disaster. Tokyo's high command, once convinced that determination and spirit alone could wrest back Henderson Field, now faced the grim reality that no amount of courage could replace the sheer tonnage of ships, supplies, and men that the United States was hurling into the struggle. The warning signs had been mounting for months. The Imperial Navy, battered in the skies and at sea, had lost some of its best air crews, men who could not be replaced quickly enough. Convoys to Guadalcanal, even those rushed under cover of night aboard the so-called Tokyo Express, were shredded by American aircraft during daylight hours. Transports ran aground or were blasted to pieces before their cargo could be unloaded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers landed on the island only to die of starvation, malaria, or the steady pound of Marine artillery. Inside the corridors of power in Tokyo, arguments grew increasingly heated. Some officers in the Imperial General Headquarters urged one last great effort, a final offensive to restore Japan's honor and seize the airfield. Others, particularly within the Navy, spoke with rare frankness. Guadalcanal had become untenable. The Americans were not the weak-willed enemy that pre-war propaganda had promised. They were resourceful, resilient, and capable of sustaining losses that Japan simply could not afford to match. By December, Emperor Hirohito himself had been briefed on the dire situation. Reports from the front were alarming. Units sent to attack Henderson Field had been annihilated, and those still alive were reduced to eating roots, coconuts, and whatever scraps they could scavenge from the jungle. Letters home, if they survived censorship, spoke of despair and fatigue. Even seasoned officers admitted that morale had collapsed. The soldiers still clung to duty, but the flame of victory had dimmed. The Navy's staff studies laid out the cold arithmetic. Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking under submarine attack, and fuel reserves were vanishing at an alarming rate. Every operation in the Solomons devoured oil that Japan could not replace. Worse still, the American shipyards were surging to life, launching new destroyers, carriers, and transports at a pace that dwarfed anything the Empire could manage. The prospect of being trapped in a war of attrition, fighting a foe with limitless industrial strength, terrified even the most hardline admirals. By early January 1943, the decision could no longer be delayed. On January 4th, the Imperial General Headquarters made a choice that only weeks earlier would have been unthinkable. Guadalcanal would be abandoned. The operation was given the coded name Key, an elegant word masking the brutal acknowledgement of defeat. Instead of launching another desperate assault, Japan would now attempt the greatest evacuation in its history, rescuing tens of thousands of soldiers from the island without alerting the Americans to their true intent. The planning was meticulous, and secrecy was absolute. To mislead Allied intelligence, Tokyo ordered diversionary operations and feints throughout the Pacific, hoping to convince American commanders that yet another offensive was coming. In reality, the Japanese Navy prepared to risk everything on a series of nighttime destroyer runs, designed not to reinforce but to extract. The same fast ships that had once carried troops and supplies into Guadalcanal would now carry the broken survivors back out. For the men still fighting in the jungle, the news came quietly. Officers told them that their heroic sacrifices had earned them rest, that their mission was complete. But among the soldiers, there was little illusion. They knew they had been beaten. Emaciated, sick, and exhausted, they welcomed the chance to leave the green hell that had swallowed so many of their comrades. The decision to withdraw marked a profound shift in the war. For the first time, Japan's leadership had admitted, if only to itself, that it could not hold ground in the face of American power. The Empire's aura of invincibility, already cracked at midway, now shattered in the jungles of Guadalcanal. From Tokyo to the front lines, the message was clear. The tide of war was beginning to turn. Soon, under the cover of night and the roar of naval guns, Operation Key would be set into motion. And with it, the Japanese would attempt to salvage not victory, but survival. In the long history of warfare, there are moments when the measure of a commander is not found in victory, but in the ability to preserve what remains after defeat. For the Japanese High Command, Guadalcanal had become a bleeding wound that could no longer be ignored. Out of this recognition was born Operation Key, a plan not of conquest, but of escape. The very naming of the operation carried an air of deception. To Allied intelligence, Japanese movements in early 1943 looked like the preparations for yet another all-out assault. Naval units surged into the Solomons, airstrikes intensified, and reconnaissance flights became more frequent. American analysts braced for a renewed offensive, certain that the Japanese would hurl themselves once more at Henderson Field. What they did not realize was that these displays of aggression were a carefully orchestrated smokescreen. The Japanese were not advancing, they were preparing to vanish. The plan was as bold as it was dangerous. Using their swift destroyers, the same sleek warships that had earned fame as part of the Tokyo Express, the Imperial Navy would slip into the waters off Guadalcanal under the cloak of night. Instead of bringing in reinforcements, these ships would load thousands of weary, starving soldiers and ferry them away night after night until the entire garrison was gone. To succeed, the operation required flawless timing, absolute secrecy, and the discipline of men who knew they were leaving a battlefield they had once sworn to die upon. In late January 1943, the plan was put into motion. As the tropical sun dipped beneath the horizon, Japanese destroyers cut silently through the dark waters of the slot. Their decks were cleared, their holds prepared, every inch of space reserved for human cargo. Offshore, cruisers and submarines lurked, ready to intercept any American ships that threatened the evacuation. Overhead, Japanese fighter squadrons staged diversionary raids on Henderson Field, drawing American attention skyward as the destroyers approached their hidden rendezvous points. On Guadalcanal itself, the evacuation unfolded with a quiet desperation. Emaciated soldiers, many reduced to skeletons from months of hunger and disease, stumbled from their jungle hideouts to the shoreline. They moved like shadows, carrying little more than their rifles and the ragged uniforms clinging to their bones. Some had to be carried by comrades, too weak to walk on their own. For many, stepping onto the deck of a destroyer felt less like retreat and more like salvation. The discipline of the Imperial Navy was astonishing. Each evacuation was conducted in near silence, broken only by whispered orders and the slap of waves against steel hulls. Within hours, the destroyers were loaded, and as dawn threatened to reveal their presence, the ships turned and vanished back into the night, carrying with them their precious cargo of survivors. For 3 nights, the operation repeated itself with clockwork precision. American forces, convinced they were facing another Japanese offensive, launched air raids and patrols in the wrong directions. The deception worked perfectly. By the time Allied commanders realized what had happened, it was already too late. The Japanese had slipped away. When Operation Key concluded in early February, the results astonished even those who had conceived it. Nearly 10,000 Japanese soldiers had been evacuated from Guadalcanal, an extraordinary feat considering the overwhelming American naval and air superiority in the region. The Japanese had transformed what could have been a massacre into one of the most daring and successful withdrawals in military history. Yet the men who returned from Guadalcanal were not victors. They were gaunt, broken, and haunted by the memories of a campaign that had consumed so many of their comrades. Their survival came at a terrible cost, the recognition that Japan could no longer dictate the terms of the Pacific War. The evacuation was a triumph of planning and courage, but it was also an admission that the Empire's reach had exceeded its grasp. For the Americans, the discovery was electrifying. Henderson Field was secure, and Guadalcanal, the island that had symbolized the turning point of the war, was finally theirs. For the Japanese, Operation Key was not an end, but the beginning of a long, slow retreat across the Pacific as the tide of war surged inexorably against them. The Great Evacuation, carried out under the veil of darkness and deception, stands as one of history's most audacious withdrawals. It was proof of the discipline and resolve of the Japanese fighting man, but also a stark reminder, even the bravest must sometimes retreat before the weight of an unstoppable enemy. By early February 1943, the long agony of Guadalcanal was drawing to a close. The Japanese, having accepted the grim truth that the island could not be retaken, had already withdrawn the remnants of their once proud garrison under the secrecy of Operation Key. For the Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, who had endured 6 relentless months of combat, disease, and hunger, the final confirmation came like the slow lifting of a suffocating fog. Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands, its runways scarred but serviceable, its skies no longer contested. The surrounding seas, once dominated by nightly duels of gunfire and torpedoes, now lay strangely quiet. The struggle for the island, one of the fiercest and most desperate campaigns of the Pacific War, was at last decided. On February 9th, American patrols fanned out across the steaming jungles and ridges that had been soaked in blood and choked with malaria. Where once Japanese units had resisted with fanatical tenacity, there was now only silence. The Americans soon realized the truth. The enemy had gone. Nearly 10,000 surviving Japanese troops had been spirited away, leaving behind shattered equipment, abandoned guns, and the skeletal remains of those who had perished from hunger and disease. The relief among the Americans was palpable, yet mingled with exhaustion so profound that celebrations came slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the men could scarcely believe that the ordeal had ended. For the United States, Guadalcanal marked more than the seizure of a strategic outpost. It was the first major offensive victory against the Japanese Empire, proof that the rising sun could be forced into retreat. The cost had been staggering. Over 7,000 Americans killed, with thousands more wounded or stricken by malaria, dysentery, and jungle fevers. The Japanese toll was even greater, nearly 25,000 dead, their once vaunted naval supremacy blunted, their air wings decimated, their soldiers reduced to starvation and despair. What had begun in August 1942 as a desperate gamble to halt Japanese expansion had become the turning of the tide in the Pacific. The men who had survived, Marines who had held Edson's Ridge, soldiers who had fought along the Matanikaw, sailors who had faced torpedoes in the deadly waters of Ironbottom Sound, and pilots who had flown weary machines from Henderson Field, now stood as the veterans of a crucible. They had been tested by the extremes of war, hunger that gnawed at their strength, nights haunted by the cry of Banzai, days seared by tropical sun and endless combat. They emerged scarred but unbroken, their resilience forging the legend of the cactus. Marines and the hard-earned confidence of a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The victory carried strategic consequences far beyond the island itself. With Guadalcanal secured, the Allies seized the initiative in the Pacific. The Japanese, forced onto the defensive, could no longer expand their empire unchecked. The Solomon Islands chain became the pathway for the next great offensive, as American forces would leapfrog from base to base, tightening the noose around Rabaul and pushing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. Guadalcanal was the first step on the long road to Tokyo Bay, where the war would finally end more than 2 years later. Yet for those who fought there, Guadalcanal was never just a name on a map. It was a place of suffering and sacrifice, of friends lost and brotherhood forged. The rusting hulks in Ironbottom Sound, the graves carved into muddy ridges, the endless memories of nights lit by tracers and artillery, all bore witness to the ferocity of the struggle. Victory was declared in February 1943, but its meaning was etched in the faces of the men who survived and in the silence of those who did not return. The campaign had been America's baptism by fire in the Pacific, a brutal initiation into the kind of grinding, no-quarter warfare that would define the battles to come. From that crucible emerged not only a secured island but a sharpened resolve. The United States had stood against the full weight of the Japanese war machine and prevailed. Guadalcanal was won. The long dark of uncertainty had lifted. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had seized the momentum. The Pacific, once dominated by the Empire of Japan, would never again look the same. The victory at Guadalcanal was decisive, but it was not won cheaply. Behind the triumph lay a ledger written in blood, steel, and human suffering. The campaign, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, was among the most grueling of the entire Pacific War. It was not a swift, glorious conquest, but a slow, grinding struggle in which attrition, disease, and endurance mattered as much as firepower. When the smoke cleared, the true cost became apparent, measured in shattered fleets, lost lives, and scars that would never fully heal. On land, the Americans counted over 7,000 dead, with many more wounded or permanently disabled. The Marines who had landed in August, brimming with determination but inexperienced in such brutal fighting, had been tempered by months of unrelenting hardship. For every man struck down by bullets or shells, many more were brought low by malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers. Entire companies were weakened, their strength sapped not by combat but by the endless grind of the jungle. The Japanese toll was even more catastrophic. Nearly 25,000 soldiers perished, not only from the battles that raged across the ridges and rivers, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Cut off from reliable supply, their rations dwindled to handfuls of rice, sometimes infested with maggots. Men who had once marched proudly for the emperor were reduced to emaciated shadows, collapsing in the mud long before bullets reached them. At sea, the cost was staggering. The waters around Guadalcanal came to be known as Ironbottom Sound for a reason. Beneath its waves rested the hulks of warships from both navies, destroyers, cruisers, and even capital ships torn apart in night battles of unprecedented ferocity. The U.S. Navy lost dozens of vessels, including the proud carriers Wasp and Hornet, while hundreds of sailors went down with their ships. The Japanese fleet, though formidable, paid even more dearly. Battleships, transports, and destroyers littered the ocean floor, testament to the ferocity of the struggle. The sea became a graveyard where oil slicks and drifting wreckage bore silent witness to the violence of the campaign. For months afterward, survivors spoke of the eerie sight of the Sound at night, its surface dotted with the glow of burning ships, the air filled with the screams of the wounded, and the thunder of shells. The psychological toll was no less severe. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was an introduction to the brutality of jungle warfare. Men who had arrived fresh from boot camp were aged beyond their years in a matter of weeks. Sleep was a luxury, rest a rare gift, and the constant fear of sudden Japanese attacks gnawed at the nerves of every soldier. Nights were filled with the cries of the wounded, the crack of gunfire in the dark, and the haunting cries of Banzai charges that broke the silence like phantoms in the jungle. Friendships were forged in foxholes, only to be shattered hours later by the blast of artillery or the spray of machine gun fire. The survivors carried those memories long after the campaign ended, their nights haunted by faces they could not forget. For the Japanese, the psychological devastation was even deeper. Guadalcanal was the first time their armies had been decisively defeated in a prolonged campaign. They had been trained to believe in their invincibility, in the certainty of victory under the divine mandate of the emperor. Instead, they faced hunger, exhaustion, and annihilation. Survivors of the withdrawal carried not just physical wounds but the crushing weight of defeat. Many would later recall the shame of leaving comrades behind, of retreating from a battlefield where they had been ordered to die. Even the local Solomon Islanders bore a cost. Their villages were bombed, their homes burned, their lives disrupted by the clash of great powers on their soil. Many risked their lives as scouts and guides for Allied forces, braving Japanese patrols to deliver vital intelligence. Their courage became part of the untold story of the campaign, yet they too endured the terror of war in their homeland. Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible of suffering where men were tested to the limits of endurance. Every ridge, river, and coastline bore the imprint of sacrifice. The island was won, but at a cost that reverberated far beyond its shores. Ships lay rusting beneath the waves, jungles concealed the bones of the fallen, and survivors carried scars that would mark them for life. The campaign was not only the turning point in strategy, but in perception. It stripped away illusions on both sides. Americans learned that victory in the Pacific would come only through prolonged sacrifice, while the Japanese realized their war of conquest had met a foe that would not yield. The cost was measured not only in the dead and the drowned, but in the very psyche of two nations, locked in a struggle that was far from over. The campaign for Guadalcanal was more than a battle for a remote jungle island. It was the fulcrum upon which the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. For the first time in the war, Japan, an empire that had swept across Asia and the Pacific with breathtaking speed, was forced not just to halt its expansion, but to retreat. Guadalcanal marked the moment when the tide of war began to roll back against Tokyo, inexorably, relentlessly, and permanently. Before August 1942, Japanese forces had seemed invincible. Their armies had stormed through Malaya and the Philippines. Their navy had struck with lethal precision at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and across the South Pacific. Each conquest deepened their aura of supremacy, instilling fear among their enemies and pride at home. But Guadalcanal shattered that illusion. For the first time, Japanese divisions, tough, battle-hardened, and fanatically loyal, had met an American foe who refused to yield. The struggle had tested both sides beyond imagination. The Japanese threw wave after wave of troops against Henderson Field, believing that sheer determination would overwhelm the Marines. They poured ships into the slot night after night, believing their long-lance torpedoes and seasoned crews could keep the seas theirs. Yet despite their courage and their tactical brilliance in moments, they could not overcome a growing reality. America's industrial might and endurance were beginning to make themselves felt. Guadalcanal became the place where the myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. The U.S. Marines and soldiers, supported by naval crews who fought desperate surface battles, and airmen who clung to Henderson Field against all odds, had proven that Japan could be beaten in a grinding campaign of attrition. More importantly, they showed that America would not stop, that it had the strength to fight battle after battle until the Pacific was reclaimed. For the Japanese, the campaign was a rude awakening. Their initial confidence gave way to a grim realization: resources were finite, replacements scarce, and the enemy more resilient than anticipated. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the seas, had suffered losses it could not replace. Skilled air crews, painstakingly trained over years, were gone in mere months, replaced by inexperienced men who could not hope to match the veterans who had been lost. The aura of dominance, carefully cultivated since 1941, had evaporated in the jungles and waters of Guadalcanal. For the Allies, the victory had an equally profound effect. It was not simply a military triumph, but a psychological one. In Washington, London, and Canberra, leaders who had once braced for endless retreat now saw hope. For American soldiers and sailors, confidence surged if Guadalcanal could be held. Then New Guinea, the Solomons, and eventually the Philippines could be taken. And beyond those, Japan itself could be reached. The turning of the tide was not immediate in its outward results. Fierce battles still loomed: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and Okinawa. But Guadalcanal had set the stage. It had proven that Japan could be stopped, bled, and ultimately pushed back. The campaign taught the Americans valuable lessons in joint operations, logistics, and jungle warfare, lessons that would be refined and repeated across the Pacific. And perhaps most significantly, it demonstrated the iron will of the men who fought there: Marines who dug into muddy foxholes, soldiers who endured malaria and starvation, sailors who faced exploding decks and burning seas, and airmen who clawed the skies with worn-out planes. They all together proved that the Allied cause had the resolve to endure suffering and emerge stronger. By February 1943, the world could sense the change. Japan, once on the offensive, was now scrambling to hold its empire. The United States, once reeling from the blows of 1941 and early 1942, was now surging forward with renewed strength. Guadalcanal had marked the beginning of that transformation, the first great reversal of fortunes in the Pacific War. The tide had turned. From this moment forward, it would roll inexorably toward Tokyo. Amid the vast sweep of strategy, ships, and divisions, Guadalcanal was still, at its heart, a human story. The clash of empires was written not only in maps and reports, but in the faces of men crouched in muddy foxholes, in the whispered prayers of sailors drifting in oil-slicked seas, and in the quiet resilience of islanders whose homeland had suddenly become the center of the world's fiercest battle. The voices of Guadalcanal, when heard together, remind us of the cost and courage of this campaign. For the young Marines who landed on Red Beach that August morning, the island was both alien and terrifying. Corporal Harold Chick Miller remembered the oppressive heat that clung to every inch of his body, the swarming insects that tormented the men by day and night, and the constant sense that death was only a few yards away. At night, the Marines huddled in their foxholes, listening to the jungle come alive. Every snapping twig could be an enemy patrol. Every shadow seemed to conceal a Japanese soldier with a bayonet fixed. When the shelling began, there was no sleep, just the thunder of artillery and the cries of men trying to survive until dawn. For the sailors offshore, life was no less perilous. Seaman First Class William Kincaid of the USS Quincy recalled the chaos of the battle of Savo Island, where Japanese cruisers unleashed a storm of shells in the dark. He spoke of decks shuddering under the impact of heavy fire, of shipmates torn apart in an instant, and of diving into the water as the burning ship rolled beneath the waves. Hours later, clinging to wreckage, he watched the horizon light up with flashes from another battle, realizing that survival in these waters was as much about chance as courage. On the other side of the lines, Japanese soldiers bore their own torment. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of campaigns in China, recalled the hunger above all else. The Japanese army on Guadalcanal fought not just the enemy but starvation. Rice rations dwindled to handfuls, then to nothing. Men scoured the jungle for roots, leaves, and anything edible. Dysentery weakened them. Malaria spread unchecked. Some collapsed on the trails, unable to march another step. "We did not fear dying in battle," Tanaka later wrote. But to starve slowly in the jungle, this was harder than courage. When the final evacuation came in February 1943, those who remained were emaciated, shadows of the warriors who had once marched ashore with confidence. And yet the story of Guadalcanal was not only written by soldiers. The native Solomon Islanders, caught in the storm of battle, played a role of quiet heroism that saved countless Allied lives. Jacob Vuza, a former policeman and respected island leader, embodied this spirit. Captured and tortured by the Japanese for refusing to betray the Marines, he survived bayonet wounds to the throat and chest. Dragging himself through the jungle, bleeding and half-conscious, Vuza delivered vital intelligence about Japanese movements before collapsing. He recovered, and his loyalty and bravery became legendary among the Americans. Many other islanders risked everything to carry messages across hostile waters in fragile canoes, to guide lost patrols through the dense jungle, and to hide downed airmen from capture. Their knowledge of the terrain, tides, and forests proved invaluable in a campaign where survival often depended on knowing which paths led to safety and which led into ambush. In the skies, airmen too had their stories etched in fire and steel. Major John L. Smith, flying from the battered Henderson field, described the exhaustion of scrambling into the air 3 or 4 times a day, fighting off superior numbers, then landing in planes riddled with bullet holes. He remembered the acrid smoke of burning aircraft, the desperate shouts over the radio, and the sight of comrades who did not return. Yet despite the fatigue and dwindling fuel, they rose again, for if Henderson fell, the island would be lost. The Japanese airmen, too, left their testimonies. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most skilled pilots, flew missions over Guadalcanal and was horrified by the grinding attrition. Unlike earlier campaigns, the Americans kept coming. Every sortie seemed to cost another friend, another comrade trained in years of hard preparation. "We fought with everything," Sakai later wrote. But every day, the Americans seemed to have more. Together, these voices, Marine, sailor, Japanese soldier, islander, and airman, paint a mosaic of human endurance. They remind us that Guadalcanal was not only a place of strategy and shifting momentum, but of lived experience, of fear and courage, of suffering and sacrifice, of loyalty and survival. When we listen to them, we hear more than the story of a campaign. We hear the heartbeat of history itself, the struggle of ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary circumstances. And through their words, Guadalcanal lives on, not as a name on a map, but as a place of human courage etched forever into the memory of the world. Would you like the final chapter to be a closing epilogue, weaving all these themes together into a reflective, cinematic conclusion for your documentary? The battle for Guadalcanal was more than a clash of arms. It was a crucible that reshaped the course of the Pacific War. What began as a desperate foothold carved out of the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands in August 1942 became a 6-month campaign of attrition that tested the limits of men, machines, and nations. By the time it ended in February 1943, Guadalcanal had become a symbol, not just of victory but of endurance, of sacrifice, and of the turning of the tide. For the United States, it was the first great offensive of the war in the Pacific. The Marines who stormed ashore in those opening days did so with untested courage, uncertain of whether reinforcements or supplies would ever reach them. They faced hunger, disease, and isolation as much as they faced bullets and bombs. Yet, their grit became the foundation of American strategy, proved that Japan could be fought, could be stopped, and ultimately could be beaten. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the shattering of momentum. Once, its armies and navies had advanced with lightning speed, conquering vast stretches of Asia and the Pacific. But on the jungled ridges and the turbulent seas around Guadalcanal, the myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. Losses of ships, planes, and irreplaceable veteran pilots hollowed out Japan's offensive strength. The campaign revealed the limits of Tokyo's empire, exposing the strains of fighting a war across such vast distances with dwindling resources. Strategically, Guadalcanal became the pivot. It was here that the United States learned the brutal realities of joint warfare, Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force coordinating under pressure, often through trial and error. It was here that American industry, though still mobilizing, began to outproduce its foe, replacing aircraft and warships at a pace the Japanese could never match. And it was here that the U.S. Navy proved it could fight at night, adapt to Japanese tactics, and ultimately seize control of the seas. But beyond the strategy and statistics, Guadalcanal left a legacy of human endurance. Men who survived the campaign remembered the ceaseless rain, the mud that swallowed boots, the cries of the wounded in the darkness, and the constant drone of mosquitoes. They remembered the empty stomachs, the bouts of malaria, and the moments of terror, when flares lit up the night sky and Japanese shells rained down on Henderson Field. Yet, they also remembered the bonds forged in that crucible, the brotherhood of Marines huddled in foxholes, the sailors who risked everything in desperate night battles, and the island natives who braved bullets and jungle paths to carry the wounded to safety. For the Japanese soldiers, Guadalcanal became a story of grim determination and tragic loss. Many fought to the last breath, driven by duty and honor, even as hunger gnawed at their bodies and malaria sapped their strength. Their commanders recognized too late that the campaign was unwinnable, and their sacrifices became part of a larger story, a testament to loyalty, but also a lesson in the futility of fighting a war against an enemy whose resources and resolve would only grow stronger with each passing month. The legacy of Guadalcanal stretches far beyond the Solomon Islands. It marked the beginning of a relentless Allied advance across the Pacific, through New Guinea, the Central Pacific, and eventually to the very shores of Japan. It inspired new confidence among the American public and proved to the world that the Allies could wrest initiative from the Axis. In classrooms, in military academies, and in books of history, Guadalcanal is studied as a turning point, a place where courage met strategy and where endurance triumphed over exhaustion. Today, the rusting hulks of ships still rest beneath Ironbottom Sound, silent memorials to the ferocity of the struggle. The ridges and rivers of Guadalcanal remain hallowed ground, where the spirits of the fallen linger in the silence of the jungle. Their sacrifice ensured that the Pacific War would not be decided by fear, but by determination. Guadalcanal was not the largest battle of the war, nor the final one, but it was the battle that proved the war could be won. Its legacy is one of courage under fire, endurance under impossible conditions, and the timeless lesson that even in the darkest of struggles, resolve and sacrifice can turn the tide of history.